need to improve our schedule management capabilities. We have with us Mohammed Adali and Dan Moses from Contract Watts. I think if anyone's worked on a public or Corps of Engineers job, the schedule is a different animal, and these guys are the experts out of Contract Watts on managing schedules. So that said, I'll leave it over to them. They can introduce themselves and some of their background and get into this.
Thanks, Matt. All right, well, like Matt said, we're from the federal side of the Erascom construction group, the Contract Watts side. Specifically, we're within the legal risk department, reporting to Ryan Lamb, our general counsel. So we want to say thank you for inviting us out here to share some of our knowledge with you guys and to hopefully make you guys aware of some of the services that are available. So if you guys get into these types of situations on your projects, you know that there's a resource available within the company that you guys can reach out to. So let's use this here. So
I'm sorry, I forgot to introduce Frank.
That's okay. Okay. So we've got Frank McConnell, who's the director of our group. Frank has over 40 years of experience in the construction business. In particular, he's spent a number of years, 15 years or so, as a claims professional before joining Contract International, which is now Contract Watts, as our in-house contract lead. So Frank has been an expert testifier in scheduling, and he's provided his leadership to our group. And so I joined the company in 2008, originally as a project manager working over in Afghanistan, and then coming back stateside in 2012 and working for Frank as a contracts manager since then. And we've got Mohammed, who's been he's worked as a scheduling professional for over 12 years. He was with us originally in Guam as the regional manager for scheduling matters there. We brought him over to McLean to be the corporate planning and scheduling manager and to help all of our regions really develop and implement good scheduling practices. So do you guys have anything else you'd like to add with regard to your resumes?
Right. You summed it up for us.
All right. So why are we here? We're here to help you guys out with this question. How do you, as project leaders, get the most benefit from your schedule? All right, there's a powerful tool that we all have available to us, and we want to make sure that we're using it for its maximum capability. We had the opportunity to work with the group from 1420 Oak back in September and October of last year. They were in a pre-dispute type of a situation, and they wanted to see if we could add any value to their discussions with regard to supporting schedule claims. And so we started getting into that schedule, and we started noticing that there were some practices that could be improved on to help us in the event that we see future claims or dispute type situations, and also just good scheduling practices that will help us regardless of whether or not we have a dispute on our hands. And so Chad and team asked us to put a presentation together and come out and see if we can't reinforce some good scheduling practices and help avoid some of the pitfalls that we can fall into if we fall out of the habit of maintaining good scheduling practices. So ultimately, oops, gotta get used to this wheel here.
Click on it.
Yeah. We want to go through the scheduling cycle from development to maintenance to record keeping and to making sure that we start off with a strong product and that we maintain that product the way that we're supposed to throughout the life cycle of the construction project. So we want to develop proper schedules, perform proper updates. And ultimately what we want to do is we want to make you guys aware of where the common pitfalls are, both in the development and production of the schedule, as well as where the pitfalls are with maintaining a schedule and doing periodic updates, so that as you're working through the project cycle, you're aware of these things and you're proactively avoiding some of the pitfalls so that One, we get the absolute most that we can out of the schedule as a tool to make us efficient and to make sure that we're staying on track and really knowledgeable of where we actually are at any given point in the life cycle. And also to ensure that in the event that we do come up with a dispute type of situation, either with the owner or a subcontractor, that we're prepared to make a presentation that's supported by what was the contemporaneous documentation, and so we can present that in a way that's compelling and in support of our company interests. And so we've got a packet that does anybody not have a packet? Okay. We'll get a couple of those in a second. So there's a lot of information in that packet. This is the order that we're going to try to go through this afternoon. Ultimately, we're not going to get to some of the latter sections just for the sake of time and the volume of information, but we're going to march through this process here. If you have any questions, we find that information resonates and stays with you best if you've got questions associated with whatever we're talking about. So please do stop. Mohammed's going to be giving the bulk of the presentation here, but please do interject when you have questions. Try to keep them relevant to what we're actually talking about, and not just a random question. But if you have questions that are topical, please raise them. And we'll follow through this sequence. So we're doing the introduction right now. We're going to spend quite a while on scheduling development. And so for those of you in here who have built out schedules, some of this information may be a little bit elementary, but we want to go through that full process just to reinforce the basics. And for those of you that don't have a lot of familiarity with the scheduling process, that will be new information for you. For others, it will be a little bit of a refresher. And then we'll get into some of the more involved processes. Schedule maintenance, we're going to talk through the update process, how to gather the information and make sure that it gets built into the schedule updates and saved properly. We're going to touch on change management, how, we're going to speak generally about it and then speak about how that gets pulled into the scheduling process to make sure that when we are preparing a request for an equitable adjustment or change order, or just submitting a proposal, that we're not going back and digging through old documentation to try to support our position. We've had that built into the schedule and we're ready to get that executed timely. We'll get into some schedule analysis and that's about the point where we may be pushing up against time. So we want to make sure that we leave plenty of time for you guys to ask questions. And so, we're going to just have to feel where we are at that point in the presentation and go from there. Beyond that, the information that's there, that's in your packets, please do take a look at that. We're going to be back and meeting with a lot of you guys tomorrow in smaller sessions. And so we're happy to get into whatever unique circumstances that you guys might be facing right now, or any questions that you might have associated with the portions of the package of information that you don't get to today. So we did want to, before we launch into the content, we do want to ask just a few questions to get a feel from you guys as to where you are from a scheduling standpoint and your involvement with scheduling. So just by a raise of hands, how many of you have created a baseline schedule from scratch? Okay, so most of you. All right, and how many of you continue to be involved with the monthly schedule update process? Okay, all right, well, that's great. On the federal side, we use Primavera P6 exclusively for our schedule updates. How many of you guys have used Primavera? Okay, all right, that's great. Yeah, we understand that you guys use ASTA on most of your projects. Mohammed has spent a considerable amount of time getting up to speed on ASTA. And so he's within the slides themselves, he'll compare some of the nuances between Primavera and ASTA. So, that's in there. Just to be clear on what this is not a presentation on, the technical intricacies of the software. It's not, we're not going to tell you how to keystroke and how to enter new activities and things like that. We assume that there's some level of familiarity with that process. If there's not, we can get into those details separately. And you know, Mohammed's a whiz with these things, and he can tell you how the most efficient way to do these things. So, but that's not really what this is about. This is more process oriented and best practices, how to avoid mistakes and how to make sure that we're doing what we're supposed to be doing. That's really about it as far as the introduction is concerned. So I'll turn it over to Mohammed, and he's going to talk you through the rest of our
Hello, everyone. As Dan mentioned, I'm Mohammed Ghali. I'm running the scheduling department for the federal side. I've been working with the company for 8 years as a scheduler, and then overall years of experience of 10 years. So I've been around the scheduling, most of the scheduling aspects throughout all the scheduling stages or life cycle as we go. As I mentioned, this training is not a software specific. I wouldn't be teaching you any software technicalities, but rather I'll be teaching you, or I'll be discussing the overall considerations to follow or best practices to follow throughout the schedule life cycle. And by schedule life cycle, generally there are three main phases for any schedule. First is how to develop a schedule, or the main consideration is when you develop a schedule. Second is maintaining the schedule and making sure it reflects your plan, dates, all these sort of stuff. And third is analyzing the schedule on a periodic basis to see where you're at and where you're heading, basically, and take actions if needed to head to the right plan or right direction. It goes. Okay. I'll start with general consideration and introductions. And in this section, I'll be discussing 4 topics: the different levels of schedule generally that we have. I'll be discussing some definitions, important definitions that will carry out through the presentation. So it's very important for you to understand the basics of these definitions. And we'll spend some time discussing the common mistakes, or the most common scheduling mistakes that we face or that we encounter throughout each of these phases that I've discussed, either development or maintenance or analysis. And last, we'll be going through some bullet points for the overall contractual obligation versus what we're discussing over here. For the levels of schedule, generally there are 5 levels of schedule, and they go from the very basic or the very a brief level, as we call it, which is level 1. That's executive summary, just the milestones. That's the summary sent for your supervisor or manager that has the milestones and where we at from a milestones perspective. It doesn't include any activities or anything. Second level is we call the management summary, and that includes the overall summary level, or we call hammocks for a main feature of work, like foundations, for example. That's where we add on foundations. That's where we add on superstructure. Finish it, just the broad lines that covers the entire feature of work. Third level, that's the project coordination schedule. That's what we use on our projects. That's the ASTA file we have, or the P6 file. That's what you update on a periodic level, and that's all what's the CPM, and we'll be discussing it, folds in, and that's the main schedule for the project. Level 4 and 5, we call it control schedules, and that's what we use on site on a daily basis to control the daily activities. Level 4 is a 2, 3, or 6 weeks look ahead, which have like tasks broken down by each day. We go throughout these tasks to just make sure we fall in line within level 3, which is the periodic schedule or the CPM schedule. Level 5 is the daily, hourly. It's a further breakdown for level 4, which is the 2 or 3 weeks look ahead. Level 3, which is the CPM, or as I mentioned, the main schedule that you develop throughout the project. It's a logic-driven schedule, and we'll be going through this. This is a schedule that has activities, that has the paths, what will happen when, and the overall projection for your plan. Some of these schedules, or depending on the specification and contract requirements, some of it is cost or revenue loaded, and it has its usage, and some of it is resource loaded. Some of it is actually used on the field to manage the resource requirements. How many hours of a specific resource you will be needing for a specific activity and managing it throughout the project. Some of them, which is the most sophisticated, would have both the cost and resource, and these type or these level of the schedule is usually used for cost controlling, like they assign resources and they assign like cost per hour, and it can get to that level, just managing the cost and the resources per resource and extracting the variances on a periodic level just to see where you're at. So there are different levels of it and sophistication, I would say. For general definitions, I'll be going through the main definitions for the CPM, the critical path method. This is the overall method that 98% of the scheduling software utilizes, and it's basically it's a method that applies dependencies between activities, and to simplify it, it's a way that we can calculate when this activity should happen, what's the latest it could happen in before delaying the overall project, and what's the successor. So what's the critical path, or what's the most important path in the project that I have to make sure I meet all the dates on, not to have my project delayed by a single day, and defining the overall milestones that start with this logic to monitor my progress on a periodic level. So as you can see here, it simplifies or it represents the activities in bar charts in several methods, but either ways, it applies dependencies, which is the relationship of these activities to each other, and through certain calculations that both softwares applies, calculate the early and late dates for each activity. The earliest this activity can happen, and the latest this activity can happen. And by the latest, I mean the latest that it could happen before it starts to delay my.
Doesn't like you.
This CPM, either an ASTA or PCX or MS project, is mostly represented through a Gantt chart or a bar chart. The Gantt chart is simply a chart that has activity listed as bars that represents the overall durations. It has ties or the relationships shown as these lines that shows the relationship between an activity and another. And usually on the left side, there is a list or a table that represents these activities with any attributes that I want to show, either durations, dates, float, anything I want to show that's related to any specific activity. That's an overall representation for the CPM in any of the softwares. Getting into the CPM, I said it defined dependencies. What is a dependency? It's a relationship between two activities. Usually there is a successor activity and a predecessor activity, and the predecessor is the one driving how the successor would function and when it would function. These dependencies in general, so there are the types of dependencies, which is the type of the relationship itself, and the categories. What kind of dependency this is. Regarding the category, we have three main categories for the dependencies or the relationship ties between any activity. The first one is called a mandatory dependency, and it's anything that the contract specifies that should be reflected between two activities. For example, we have phase 1 and phase 2 project. Phase 2 cannot start except after phase 1. That's a contractual obligation that has to be reflected. It's not something that physically has to happen. It's something that the contract specifies and the schedule should adhere to. So that's a mandatory dependency. It's anything that the contract requires you to reflect in your schedule. The second is the obligatory dependency, or what we call the hard logic. This is construction. So any tie between an activity that cannot physically happen except this way. An example is columns and slab. I cannot pour the slab except when I have columns. That's the hard logic. It cannot happen otherwise. So the hard logic in general is what defines construction, and it's based on expert judgment. It's based on anyone who performed such activities before. He knows how physically these activities goes. I have to excavate the trench before I would lay the pipe. That's a hard logic. It cannot happen otherwise. The third category is a discretionary dependency or soft logic. These are ties that we add to, for many reasons actually, and we'll be discussing it in details, but basically after we apply the hard logic, we want to optimize the resources, for example. If we left everything tied together through its hard logic, everything will be happening at the same time. Okay, I want to optimize my resource. I have two buildings. I want this building to start after the first building, so I have a better resource leveling. That's a soft logic. If the contract specifies 1,000 days duration, I want to span my construction throughout the 1,000 days because I have 1,000 days. So I will add ties to optimize my resource usage, to optimize everything in the project, to span out throughout the project duration. These are the general kinds of soft logic. And we'll be discussing these in detail. Other important definitions for dependencies are the lags and leads. A formwork starts, and a couple of days after, the reinforcement guys comes in to start tying reinforcement. So if I would say that the reinforcement would start 5 days after the formwork starts, this 5 days is defined as a lag. So a lag is basically a spacing that defines a gap between two activities that cannot happen elsewise. Like other example, excavating, I have to excavate the trench, and 3 days after I've done that part in the trench, I will start laying pipes. These 3 days are considered lags. As for leads goes the other way around. So I pour the slab and it's curing. I want to start forming my columns 5 days before the curing finishes. So 5 days ahead of the predecessor, which is the curing. That's a lead. So the columns formwork should lead the finish of the curing by 5 days. That's an example of leads. And again, we'll be discussing it further ahead. After applying dependencies in the CPM, it calculates the early and late dates, and from these dates, it calculates the float. And I'm sure most of you have heard of the term float. There are two types of float. Basically, what is the float? It's the amount of time that an activity could be delayed. Okay, the free float, we have a free float and a total float. A free float is the amount of time that an activity could be delayed before delaying its successor. Regardless, this activity will finish, I've added all my dependencies, my logic, and this activity finishes 5 days before its successor starts, because its successor is being driven by another activity. So these 5 days are considered a free float. Okay. What if this activity has a free float? So here, for example, activity G finishes 5 days before activity H. That means that activity G could be delayed 5 days before delaying activity H. That's a free float. This is the project completion date. Activity H have 3 days of free float from activity F, meaning it could be delayed 3 days before delaying activity F. That's all free float. So what is the total float? The total float is the amount of time an activity could be delayed before delaying the overall project, not just its successor. So in that example, 5 days and 3 days, this is the free float for G, and this is the free float for H. But H is tied to the last activity of the project. If it got delayed 3 days, it will delay its successor, but it will delay the overall project completion. So these 3 days are free float and total float. What about G? G has a 5 days and 3 days. If it got delayed 5 days, that's a free float. But what if it got delayed 8 days? It will start delaying the overall project. That means that activity G has 5 plus 3 days of total float, which is 8 days of total float. That's the difference. And that's a very important definition to understand in the CPM, because this basically would define our next slide, which is the critical and the longest path. So we knew the dependencies, the float, the free and total float. What does it mean that an activity have a total float of 0? It means that this activity, if it got delayed by a single day, it will delay the overall project. So what do we call these activities that have a total float of 0? We call them critical path activities. And the logic that ties them all together, that filled up the entire duration to have a 0 total float, that's a critical path. That's our project critical path. So basically, it's the path that has a 0 float or a negative float. So let's say a path have been delayed and it has a negative 10 days of float. What does it mean? That it's been delayed beyond the required contract completion by 10 days. So the critical path would be any path that has a 0 or negative float, any path that finishes on time or delayed beyond the required completion date.
And the total float, though, don't we subtract the duration of the activity? If you go back, G is 2-day activity, H is 3-day activity. You can't say, no I seeing that wrong?
No, you don't subtract the duration. You basically sum up the free floats on the path. So here, let's say activity H was 10 days.
Okay.
Still, the total float would be 8 days. Because if this got delayed by 5 days and if this got delayed by 3 days, it will start delaying the overall project, regardless of the duration of activity H. So the activity's duration is not factored in summing up. It adds up. Like, I think your question would be if it's the same scenario and this activity changed from 5 days to 10 days, or from 5 days to 6 days, it will eat up from the 3 days and then it will affect the float. But for a float calculation, if everything is set, we only add up the free floats to come up with the total float for a certain activity. Okay, so now we know the critical path. It's any path that has a 0 total float or a negative total float. We have another very important definition, which is the longest path. What is the longest path? The longest path, generally, is the most critical path. What does it mean? So we have a project, we have building A and building B, both same type of building, same everything, same number of floors, and both have the same amount of time to be completed, which is they complete at the project completion date. So I have two critical paths that finishes on the project completion required date. What if activity at building B got delayed by 10, 20 days? So now I have building A finishing on time with a 0 float and building B finishing 20 days beyond the completion date. As I mentioned, the critical path is any path that has a 0 or negative float. So that means that this rule applies in both. So this rule, building A and building B are critical, or the paths for building A and B are critical paths, but building B is the longest path because it takes longer. It's the longest critical path, or the most critical path. So if I have 10 paths that goes from 0 total float to negative 20, the longest path will be the one with the least total float, which is the one with the negative 20 days of total float. All the rest will be critical paths, but these are not longest paths. Does that make sense? Okay. To make you understand it better, let's go the other way around. Let's say that building A and building B were finishing ahead of time. Okay, and building A is finishing 1 month ahead of time, but building B is finishing 10 days ahead of time. Both buildings are finishing ahead of time. That means the overall project is finishing ahead of time. But is it a critical path? It's not a critical path because it's not a 0. Both passes have a positive float on it. That means they still have time to spare before affecting the overall project completion. So we don't have a critical path, but building A being finished 10 days before the completion date, when compared to building B that finishes a month ahead of the completion date, that is the longest path for the project. So I would still have a longest path even all my paths were finishing ahead of time, but I wouldn't have a critical path. Critical path is the path that has a 0 or delayed, but when it's a positive float, it's only a longest path. Okay? That was the general definitions. Now we'll go through the overall mistakes. I'll go through the mistakes for the schedule development, maintenance, and analysis. And I'll just go through these mistakes and how it affects the schedule. And as we go through each of these sections, we'll be going in details how to rectify or avoid these general mistakes. For the schedule development, what are the most common problems that we see in a baseline schedule? First is missing scope. Like people don't spend as much time reviewing the RFPs, the specifications, the drawings to make sure they covered every aspect of the project scope. And that usually you find out that you missed the scope 50% throughout the project, and you had to add this bunch of activities on the longest path that all of a sudden reflected a negative 50 days of float on your project because you missed the scope. Second is the level of detail. How many projects you've seen that has construct footings, construct superstructure, apply MEPs, and it's just like a very generic road level. So what happens when a part of the footing, like you've constructed 30% of the footing and then you encounter as different site conditions, and now this activity, part of it will progress and part of it would not progress, then you would have to break it down further and split it up. And it's not a good practice to have this. this is not a schedule. This is what we call, if you would recall, the management summary or the executive summary. That's just a broad activities. It doesn't have activities that you can monitor each month to know where you're at and where you're heading. Durations. How long it will take? It will take 10 days, put 10 days. And then, on site when it's happening, it's taking 20 days. Why? Because I assumed it will take 10 days. So the adding duration based on like, because we think it would take, is a terrible mistake that we see in all the schedules. And it's one of the main factors for having this negative periodic flow throughout the updates, because usually when you go through your updates, you're just rectifying the durations that you estimated at the baseline based on experience or based on something other than productivities and quantities. Logic, reflecting the wrong logic in general, just adding setting formwork and an RFT at the finish to start when they happen in parallel with the lag. So having the incorrect logic or false logic in the schedule, again, is one of the very common mistakes. Open-ended relationships. I wouldn't go through this. We'll go through it in details, but all the activities should have a predecessor and a successor for the schedule to function as a complete network. And that's one of the biggest mistakes we always find.
Is that both a logic and a crew time? Would you require both? Would you say best practices to have both?
Is which both?
To basically have a actual physical and a crew tied between it, built into your logic for each activity.
Well, the crew would affect how the crew relationship is a soft logic that we mentioned. Right. So there is a physical and we said there is a hard and soft logic. So both has to be in the schedule and both has to be reflected one way or another in the schedule. So if you're planning that your acoustical steel and crew would finish this room and this room, you have to reflect that in the schedule if you're not resource loading your schedule. And that's a resource load. And that's a logic that has to be reflected. That goes in here. But the open ends is something else. The open ends is that activity doesn't have a successor, just like the path ends here. And we'll go through it in detail. Constraints. The client requires that in a meeting, guys, we need this done next week. Okay, so I'll go on the schedule and just like tie it up. This should finish next week and I'll apply constraint to it. When adding too much constraints in the CPM, you cannot count on the early, late dates, floats, free floats, total floats, nothing. It messes up the float calculation big time because now the path sums up the float for two paths, or the CPM, the software sums up the float for two paths, and it's part of the activities would reflect the float on the first path that's constrained, and another would reflect the float on the second path that's constrained elsewhere. So long story short, constraints messes up the schedule. So we'll go through it, the overall consideration, but that's a very common mistake we find. Excess or minimal float on the schedule. Again, I wouldn't go in details, but let's say you have a contract duration and your paths, and you tied it all up so it all spanned through the construction period, but all of the paths is like either critical or near critical. All of the paths that you have can be delayed maximum 10 to 14 days before delaying up the project. Do you think that this project will be achievable? Never. Like paths will be delayed and the overall project will be delayed. And same thing for having a minimal float. Again, we see this, if you just didn't apply the soft logic and you left the hard logic as is, everything will be moving in parallel. Everything will be moving in parallel. All the paths having an insane amount of float to the project completion, and that's not scheduling. That's basically, I'll start any of these paths whenever I feel like it. Where's the logic? Where's anything? That's not scheduling at all. The stakeholder input and review, again, that's a very common mistake. A PM or a scheduler would have the drawing, would have everything, would sit in his room and just like put the schedule together and submit it as is. Would the PM be the one performing the actual work? No. Where's the superintendent? Where's subcontractors? Where is have you taken account the quotations for procurement to receive from your vendors? A lot of stuff. So a baseline schedule has to take into account the stakeholders. Whoever is going to perform this project should be involved into putting its schedule together. No code or responsibility assignments. That's it's a mistake, but it's not a crucial mistake. Like that's, I will be going through it. There's no proper categorization of work within the schedule. So it's very hard to read. It's very hard to extract the mechanical subcontractor scope of the electrical subcontractor scope, and it makes it harder to navigate through your schedule. What about the schedule maintenance? So these are the mistakes for the development. When updating the schedule monthly, what common stuff that we go through it? What's the most common issues that I've seen in many of our projects and in many of the projects I've worked on? First is that the update does not reflect your plan. Like what's in the update, what's in the schedule is a whole different thing from what's on site. And just like it's a whole different plan. It's just like, yeah, we know we have a building, but like I have a separate plan in my mind, and the schedule has its own scheduling plan. Second is the percentage. There are plenty types of percentage completion, and we'll go through it. Reflecting the proper progress percentage for activities and projects is a very crucial element for knowing where you're at percentage completion wise. And we'll go through this in details, what types and what to use and what not to use. The remaining durations, again, that's one of the most common. Activity 10 days duration, and it started 2 days ago. It started 10 days ago, and I finished 20% of it. So I will still have a remaining duration of 8 days, because I finished 80% and it was 10%. So I'll put the remaining duration to meet the planned duration. So this 20% should have been completed in 2 days. Although I finished them in 10 days, I will still project 8 days remaining duration. That's totally wrong. The considerations for remaining duration, we'll discuss it, but it has to be based on what happened, how much you performed in this activity, and in how long you performed to estimate your remaining duration. Adapting schedule to site progress, not the other way around. How many of you guys have seen that we collect the data for the update, we're reflected in the schedule, and now we have our schedule. The next update, we progress on site however we want to progress, and then we're reflected in the schedule, and so on. It should be the other way around. The plan or the progress on site should reflect the plan you have in the schedule, not the other way around. What happens, and what I've seen in many projects, they progress according to their own sub-plans, and then each update, they want to reflect that in the schedule. It should be the other way around. That's our plan, that's our goals for the next update, and that's what we're doing. And progress on site should reflect this plan, not the other way around. Again, we're in the update phase. How many of you have seen people that does an update just to report it? Because it's a client requirement, so we want to plug anything just to fulfill our contractual requirements, and here's your schedule. Or in our case, we do the billing through our schedule. So I've seen many cases where they just like use the schedule to apply percentages and extract their billing and submit it to the client. And again, that's not scheduling. It's not very common, but I've seen it a lot. Here's the client schedule, and here's the site schedule. And these are two different versions, showing two different completion dates, showing everything different. So that's a terrible mistake, and usually it puts us in a really bad situation, progress-wise, because you're never able to capture the most realistic plan, because you're showing two different plans. And in case of any conflict resolution or disputes with the client, if the thing popped up that you're showing different dates from your actual plan, that puts us in a really difficult situation.
Illegal in the federal law.
Yeah, it's illegal. Inside of having it illegal, it's a very bad practice. Like you're never able to maintain both or have a one schedule that governs your realistic plan. Same as the development, minimal stakeholder reviews, minimal subcontractor inputs in the updates in the upcoming projection in the plan. and changes and impacts. A lot of impacts and changes happen on site, and we'll be discussing it. These changes are rarely reflected in the schedule, although they affect your plan. You have a different site condition, that's an impact. It will take 5-6 months to rectify. This has to be reflected as an impact to show all the details with the projection for when it will happen. And we'll be discussing what to project and what not to project in the change management section. Last but not least, documentation. For many reasons, first of which is any conflict resolution, any disputes, you would need to go through all the documents and history of the schedule to apply proper analysis, to present your case, to support your case. Other than the usage of documentation into studying the as-bills, the actual productivities that you guys had on site, it's very important. And again, we'll be going through it. Last aspect in the mistakes is the schedule analysis. The most common issues I found when doing an analysis on schedule is just like misreading the schedule. What do you look for in a schedule after you maintained it to know where you're at and where you're headed? So you wouldn't go through the flow path, and we'll discuss it. You wouldn't go through your longest path. You wouldn't have key performance indices or KPIs or milestones that you measure on a monthly basis to compare where you are from where you're at, and accordingly project where you're heading. So having these stuff and recording it on a monthly basis is very crucial to understand where you're at in your schedule lifetime and where you're at as a progress compared to your plan. No work prioritization. As I mentioned, no variances. You don't compare this month update to the previous to come out with how much time we've lost, how many activities we should have completed and we did not, and a lot of other stuff that we'll go through it. And last, you never use the updates to identify your potential risks in the schedule, and you cannot identify the risks without measuring the variances, without knowing what happened throughout the month, and without seeing or capturing a trend for these variances to know where you're heading, and therefore a risk is identified. And again, we'll go through it. Last part in this section is the contractual obligations. All what we'll be discussing over here today is for reference. It's not contractual. It's something that we based on the best practices, the publication that's out there. It's for your reference to apply better scheduling methodologies in your project for a better project management. Okay, any conflict between the contract specifications and what we're mentioning over here, the contract specs always takes precedence. If I said anything here that conflicts with your contract specifications, your specification is right. What I'm saying is not applicable in your case. So that's a general rule. It's applicable to any and every slide within our presentation today. Most of the contract specifications would have a scheduling section that have certain guidelines, that have certain criteria that you have to adhere to. Again, you have to go through this section and define these guidelines, and it takes precedence over what I'm mentioning. Last is the contractual milestones are, as I mentioned, mandatory dependencies. They have to be extracted before anything. That's the first step in a schedule development. They have to be identified, and everything applied in a schedule should meet these milestones. And that's for the introduction.
You guys have any questions or comments with regards to some of the mistakes that maybe you guys have seen or experienced, and how they've affected your ability to manage your projects, or anything that kind of ties back to how we just went through?
I got one thing. We've always been told never to use negative lags, which sounds kind of like what you described as leads.
Negative lags are leads.
Or leads. So
Yeah.
So is it the same thing?
No, I'll mention it. I'll mention it. Again, if the contract says don't use it, then don't use it. If it doesn't say, then it's not a best practice. It's in there, but it's not a best practice. And I'll mention it in the development. Same thing for the start-finish relation, and we'll go through it. Okay, the scheduling development. Now, for the first phase in the schedule lifecycle, how to make a good schedule. and what's the overall considerations that should be followed when developing a schedule. Again, it's not software specific, it's an overall consideration. Let's start with a very general question. What makes a good schedule? What defines a good schedule? How would you tell that this is a proper schedule that would be beneficial on site versus that schedule? So the first thing is a good schedule has to cover the entire project scope. That's for sure. Second, it has to have a proper breakdown. The scope should be reflected in a way that anyone who reads the schedule should be able to comprehend what's this project, what's the main components for it, how it is broken down. It should have realistic durations, and that's for granted, and we'll be going through it. Responsibilities, again, it's not a must, but it's a very high recommended practice to assign responsibilities for each of these activities. It makes it easier for you guys to manage the subcontractors, to know what's your own scope versus the client scope versus the mechanical subcontractor scope. It's very beneficial to use. A schedule has to be achievable. You don't set up an insane, like unrealistic plan and hoping it would be achieved. It has to fall in line within your capabilities as a contractor, within your resources, within your previous productivities. These stuff has to be taken into consideration when planning a schedule for it to be achievable. It has to optimize the resource usage. It has to fulfill the contract requirement, and we've been through this. Anything in the contract has to be extracted and added as a top priority when developing a schedule and when maintaining it. Similar to the breakdown structure, it has to have a proper categorization of work, and it's basically the same with a slight difference that we'll be going through. It has to account for any project circumstances, where the project is being performed, the overall procurement durations, how available are my resources, how hard is it to bring a subcontractor over here for very specific tasks, how far is the project. All these stuff has to be taken into consideration when developing a schedule. It has to reflect an accurate work periods. A schedule being performed in the Middle East would have a different holidays, work periods, weekends than a schedule being performed in the US, for example. These stuff has to be taken into consideration. If the client has his own days off, for example, and the contract directs you to turn off the site when they are off, this has to be taken into consideration. Long story short, the work periods or the calendars as we will go through. A level of detail, which is tied to the scope. These are two very important things, and needless to say, that's what defines your activities and your overall scope or schedule. Last is the relationships, reflecting the hard logic, soft logic, anything that you that makes proper sense to tie two activities together should be reflected in a schedule. And again, we'll go through. So these are the attributes for a good schedule. What we'll be doing is, these are what I just mentioned, and I've reflected or added a step that help us achieve each of these. And as we go through it, we'll always recall, for example, when we're defining a scope, remember that one of the very most common issues is not being able to break down the scope or cover entirely the scope. So we'll be referring to the schedule of mistakes as we go through these steps. So cover the entire scope, that's the component of a good schedule. So we'll go through how to define what's the consideration to define the scope. Proper breakdown structure, what's consideration to create a WBS, work breakdown structure, or an asset called the PDS, project breakdown structure. Level of detail, how to create activities. What basis should we create the activities on? What considerations to take into account? Realistic durations. Okay, the durations is a big issue, and we'll mention that. What factors should I take into consideration when estimating my duration, and how should I do this? Relationships, how to add relationships, the steps for adding relationships, considerations, what to do and what not to do to have the proper logic into your schedule. Calendars, which is the work periods I mentioned, according to the project location, according to the circumstances, the client, calendars has to be defined and assigned to the activities, and we'll present how impactful our own calendar can be on the project overall duration. And then achievable, the overall logic path is makes common sense according to the resource availabilities, according to the crews available, according to the subcontractors, according to your corporate standards and ability to perform. Categorization of work and defining responsibilities. This would be coding. I will go through this briefly. And fulfilling contract requirements. That's the last step within the development. Okay, defining scope. We have two main types of projects: a design-build project and a design-bid-build project. A design-build project is something I don't have a design for it. The part of my scope is designing the project, so I don't have drawings. I don't have a breakdown of the scope, basically. A design-build project, design-bid-build project, something that's been designed by the client, and I have a complete set of drawings, and I just need to perform or execute this project. Because of the different level of details that's available in each of these types, definitely they have different approach for defining the scope. We'll start with the design-bid-build project, the one that I have drawings to, that I can build up my scope on, and it'll be very similar on design-build with a slight variance that I'll go through. First step in defining your scope is going through your RFP, request of proposal, and specifications. Why do we go through these stuff? To define many things. Basically, define any contractual obligations that should be reflected in a schedule. Some of these are the milestones, as I mentioned, all the contractual milestones that should be reflected, the submittals required, any restrictions, any meetings requirements, any phasing requirements. A project requires phase 1, 2, 3, the durations of these stuff. The project durations in general is listed in the specifications or the RFP. So this is a very important first step. After I've gone through the first step for defining these stuff, I start digging into the drawings. You'll go through the drawings as much as possible, define the main components. What is this project is composed of? The buildings, define buildings, and then for each building, how many floor, what's the main items you have, what type of ceilings, what type of floorings, the site development issues, site development components, paving. Define the overall component throughout your drawings. So this has to be done thoroughly, and you have to spend the time to go through the drawings because that's where you extract your scope from. The drawings, you use it to define the WBS, not the activities. What is the difference? I want to know my project breakdown structure, how it is broken down. What's the buildings I have? What's the items I have in my project? The activities it's not part of the WBS, but it completes the WBS. Meaning is you break down your project into different levels until you reach the last level, which we call the work package. And we'll go through this when we reach the WBS. The activities is what you fill up this work package with. So I would go up till the first floor any piece, for example, and that's the last level on my work breakdown structure. The activities is what's going to fill this last level of WBS, and we'll be going through it. But it's very important point that defining scope helps you define the WBS, not the activities. The scope definition should be done independently by the project team. Each of the participants at the time of developing the baseline, either a project manager or superintendent, should do this step independently and then meet up and verify what they have put together with each other, just as a validation verification for the scope to make sure it covers the entire scope. And one very important thing, after they do this, they have to compare this to the project estimate to make sure everything in the estimate is covered in their scope definition and vice versa. That's for the design bid build. For the design build, again, it's the only difference, the only thing that differs is that you don't have a design yet, but you will have it as a part of your project. So there is two approaches for defining a scope in a design build. First is that you create two baselines. One, we call a design baseline. Simply, I will create a baseline that have the design activities, and afterwards, I'll just have a broad generic activity that called that's named foundations or construction in general. And I would leave it as is and update the design as I go through until I have a complete set of design, and then I will apply the same steps in defining the design bid build schedule scope. So create a design baseline, define the design because that's what I know. Put a generic construction. Once the design is complete, create another baseline called construction baseline, and then detail the scope as possible according to the completed drawings that you receive from the design of record. The second approach is very similar, but you simply create one baseline, and as you go through the process of design development, as much as you receive from your designer, you will start reflecting that in the schedule. So I received the foundation package, for example. I'll break down the foundation and leave the remaining scope as is. I received the superstructure. I'll break down the superstructure. I received the MEPs. I'll break down the MEPs, and it goes throughout the design process. Like it's a scope development process throughout the design. So by the time the design is completed, you already have 90% of your scope completed based on the packages completed by your designer. This approach is called the rolling wave technique. It's just like, it's a rolling wave. The more information you get, the more breakdown you apply, and so on and so forth until you have your complete construction scope definition. After we've defined the scope components, we start creating our work breakdown structure. And as I mentioned, ASTA call it PBS or project breakdown structure. It's the same thing. The work breakdown structure is a categorization of work according to how you see fit. How do you divide the project components as a project manager or as a scheduler or a superintendent developing the schedule? One thing I want to point out, there is no one way to develop a WBS. Like two PMs could create different WBS for the same exact project. And a simple example for that, if I have a big building that's phased into phase 1 and phase 2, so I can create a WBS that's the project, phase 1, and under phase 1, I will include the portion of the building that falls under phase 1. And under phase 2, I will add the portion of the building that falls under phase 2. And it will be broken down this way as a work breakdown structure. Another way of applying it is having the building and underneath the building, phase 1 component and phase 2 component. So it's just a layout approach. The important thing is that it has to be broken down to reflect the overall scope that was defined in the previous step. Two things I want to point out. When creating a work breakdown structure, the whole approach or what you want to do is create as few levels as possible to reflect the overall scope. You don't want to over detail your WBS, like for no obvious reason. Like if I have level 1 that has 5 activities underneath, I don't need to break this into like level 1 mechanical, for example, or electrical. Create the WBS to have the minimal level to reflect the proper scope. Don't over detail it, don't over add levels to the breakdown structure because it makes it very hard to read the schedule once you print it. As I mentioned, the last level in any WBS is called work package, and that's the level where we add activities to. Here's a simple layout. Usually, any breakdown structure falls within this same layout. General pre-construction stuff, construction, procurement, closeouts, and under construction we'll put building A, building B, or phase 1, phase 2, and so on. And in ASTA, similar to P6, it's broken down, it's color coded according to the level. And as we can see here, under submittals, prepare and submit, review and approve. That's a work package that I will start adding the activities to. Each activity would reflect the submittals. And that's, if you would see over here, that's level 4. But in construction or structures, for example, we have phase 1. Under phase, we have the area, building, foundations, interiors. Under interiors, we have mechanical, electrical, and then I will start adding activities here. So as you see here, the level is like level 8, and for submittal, it's level 4, and these are the work packages. I will add activities here to level 4, and I will add activities here to level 8. It doesn't have to be the same level. The only thing we want to understand is that the last level, we call it a work package. Okay, we defined the scope, we created the WBS. What's next in developing a schedule? Breaking down the activities. So, needless to say, activities is the most crucial component in any schedule, because that's what everything is added to. All the relationships, durations, everything. What defines your project is the activities. So this step, put as much effort in it to make sure it's done correctly and according to these overall guidelines. So activities, it's anything that consumes time and resources. It has to be measurable. Activities should be created, as I mentioned, under each work package to reflect this single work package. So the mechanical within floor 1, within building A, within phase 1, should reflect the mechanical activities for this floor specifically. So the activities has to reflect the work package, and doing this for all the work packages in a WBS would cover your entire scope. A list of logically tied activities are called fragmentary network or fragment. That's a very common term used in many of the specs I've seen, and it's just a term to define a set of activities that's tied. Let's say we have spread footings. So I have 20 activities that define the spread footings and tied together. I would call this a fragment. So any set of activities that define a specific feature of work tied together is called a fragment. Okay, for defining activities, first, I can start building up my activities based on templates for any similar work I have. So I have spread footings, and I've done the spread footings in 20 other projects. I can just take the fragment from other project and then fine tune it to match the project I'm building the activities in. Fine tune it in durations, fine tune it in everything. The template I should build up my activities for this project can be extracted from the previous one, but I would only use the breakdown because it's the same breakdown, same steps for constructing a spread footing anywhere in the world. So just take the activities as a template, and P6 doesn't have it, ASTA does. You can save templates. So if you're working on multiple projects, you can save templates in your ASTA, so you're able to just like, I would open up the template form and select spread footings or select a beam construction, and then it will present the template for this kind of construction, and then you can add it in your project. But again, use a template to start off from, fine tune it after you just add it in the new project. Okay, if you don't have a template, what do? It will all be then depending on your expertise and experience for constructing this feature of work. If no template, then okay, have you done this work before? If you did it, then start breaking it down. If you don't, who's doing it? Is it a subcontractor? You have to meet with a subcontractor. So if there are no templates, if it's a different kind of work that you haven't done before, it has to be done through collaboration. It has to be done through meeting with the expert or a consultant or whoever is going to perform this work that has done it before, that knows what it takes and the activities breakdown for this specific work. If the subcontractors are not available at the time, then you would do your best into breaking down these activities. But once the subcontractor is assigned, they have to review this breakdown and validate that yes, these are the activities that should be added to reflect their scope. For procurement activities are the last activities that should be added in a schedule, because simply you want to build your entire schedule and then define which of these activities needs items that will be procured, and go backwards to define these activities into a procurement section. The level of details, okay. We when creating an activity, what's a proper level of detail? And as we mentioned in the mistakes, that's a very common mistake, either having a very excessive level of detail or a very broad constructing footings. So what is a proper level? First, I want to explain briefly, as I mentioned, the excessive level of detail. If you're having 20 activities that cover 2 days in the schedule, it will be a nightmare to update the schedule and maintain it and have it maintained properly throughout the project life cycle to be used in measuring progress and projecting your plan. That's for the excessive part. What about the generic part? Again, the generic part is a management summary. It's not something that you can use to plan your work or measure your performance. Okay, the maximum level of detail for activity, according to the industry standards and like the best practices, it shouldn't be anything less than 1 or 2 days, preferably 2 days. So don't add a bunch of activities that all happening in a single day, except like for a very specific reason, but generally don't do it. If a bunch of activities happen in a day or two, that's one activity. One activity that you can monitor. You can break it down further into the control schedules as we'll go through it, but on a CPM schedule, you don't want to go below a day or two for an activity. So that's your maximum level of detail. What's the minimum level of detail? And that's way more important. Again, according to the best practice, the minimum level should be completed within a periodic cycle. So it depends on the contract specification and your project. How often do you do your updates? Is it bi-monthly or monthly or once every 2 months? According to this periodic cycle, that's what defines the minimum level. You don't want to go any day beyond the periodic cycle. So if you do it monthly, the minimum level of detail, which is the maximum duration for an activity, should be 30 days. And why is that? Why it should match your periodic cycle? Simply because after 2 updates, if it started and it hasn't completed, then there is an issue. It raises a flag that any activity that starts in the periodic, in any update, should at least, or should maximum, by maximum finish within 2 update cycles. So if activity started and I see like a 40 days of actual duration, that's something, because the maximum duration I have is 30 days. So there has to be an impact, there has to be an issue. That's a red flag that you should be addressing. And that's why there is a maximum level. Of course, the maximum level, the procurement is an exception to the maximum level. Whenever you add procurement in your project, add the fabrication time, depending on the quotation you receive from the vendor, and it should have the entire duration, 150 days, 180 days. There's no rules for it. Okay, now that we've defined the activities, we have the WBS, we have the activities. What do? We calculate the durations for the activities. Again, durations can get very tricky and can have a very significant impact on the project as you update it. Ideally, the duration should be based on quantities, productivities, and crews. This equation should be applied to extract the duration. And it's very important to have a base for your duration. So in case you want to recover or mitigate, you have something to start from. This activity, I have 1 crew. This duration is based on a single crew. I can add crews here to mitigate it. It's very important. It really reflects the accuracy of your overall project. So quantities, productivities, and crews. Okay. Quantities, usually it's extracted. I'll go through the exceptions, but usually you have the quantities in your estimate. Do as much effort as possible to break it down by activities. You define activities based on the components, and the estimate should match this some way. So do as much effort to break it down by activities. Productivity, you have one of 2 options. The first is if we have a record, if we're doing a proper documentation for our projects, we would have an as-built durations that's tied to a previous project quantities that I can extract productivities from. Applying these productivities on the quantities would get me durations. And depending on how many crews I have, or how many crews I'm willing to assign for this specific activity, would define my activity duration. Okay, that's
I'm sorry to interrupt, but
Sure.
typically when we build our schedules, we try to get our subs input, but we kind of maybe come up with a duration that we feel is gonna work, but then we haven't really drilled down that far as trying to look at duration based on quantity and productivity.
That's,
That's typical, I'm just.
yeah,
you know,
yeah, I totally know.
I know if it's right or wrong, but.
No.
For the most part, that's how we get there.
That's why I mentioned here that ideally that's what should happen. Like that's by the book. Any duration should be based on production, quantities, and improves. Okay.
You're doing that in your head without even knowing.
Yeah, but we don't use the means manual, we just kind of.
Again, I'm referring this in case, so in our case, for example, usually for the self-performed work, I would have quantities from from our estimates, but I wouldn't have productivities. And that's when I go to the RS means to extract productivities and factor it according to our location and come up with a productivity rate that I can apply to the quantities we have in the estimate. So it depends on what level of estimate you have. It depends on whether we have productivity or not, but ideally that's what should happen. Okay, if no quantities are available, definitely wouldn't be able to apply this method, and that's what you mentioned. Then we refer to one of two things, either the expert judgment, something you'll perform this before and know roughly how it will take, or refer to the subcontractor performing this work to get an estimate for the duration. But again, it's like what's perfectly what should happen, and if not, if these information were not available, then we do this. One thing I want to point out, this logo, when you add it, I wouldn't be going, any slide that has this logo, I wouldn't be going through the details for it. It's more details about the durations and overall considerations. One thing I want to point out in this slide is regardless which method you follow to estimate your duration, you have to create an assumption log with the baseline. It's very important. On what basis you assume these durations. Why is that? Simply because if I estimated, if I did the expert judgment and talked to the subcontractor and I estimated I would be excavating with a specific productivity. If I reflected this productivity in an assumption log, okay, it would take 10 days and this is roughly X amount of cubic yards, so the average productivity is Y. And I reflected that in an assumption log for all the excavation. Once I start my project and start measuring productivity from the very first activity, oh, this is taking me much longer. So I would just go to my assumption log and rectify all the activities that is similar to this first activity and reflect that into the duration. So if you did an assumption, regardless how you do it, put it in a log with the baseline and save it. Once you start the activity, if there is a significant variance between the estimated production or the estimated judgment that you had versus what's inside, go back to your assumption log, filter all the activities that have the same features, and reapply the actual production into your baseline. So at least you would know way ahead of time that these activities would take you X amount of time longer than what's planned. Okay, now I have WBS activities, durations added. What to do next? Tie it all up. Tie it all up by applying logic and relationships. And this is what creates what we call a logic-driven network. And that's what I'm trying to achieve eventually. Each schedule should act as a network. All the activities should be linked together to act as a network. When an activity gets delayed, it affects the overall network. So I would see the impact of this activity on the project and how it can or how it would delay me. Okay. The overall steps for adding relationships. First, we start by the hard logic, as we mentioned, something that cannot physically happen except this way. And we extract this from, again, templates or expert judgment. After we apply the hard logics, the things that's needed for physically construction these items, we start applying the soft logic. And the soft logic, as I mentioned, we apply it for any of these regions, either to reflect the overall sequence. So I have a bunch of buildings, I apply the hard logic, I want to do building A, B, C, D, and so on. That's the sequence I'm planning to follow. Then adding these ties between the buildings, that's what we call the soft logic. Okay, I added these, and then I have a bunch of miscellaneous stuff, and I still have time in my project. I would add ties after I finish the buildings to span my construction throughout the project duration. why would show, if no incentive, why would plan my work at 6 months ahead when I have a year to complete? So generally start off by scanning the construction. When you're performing, if you're overperforming and you're taking less durations, then it will eat up, it will give you a float, and then you can finish ahead. But don't set your initial plan to finish 6 months ahead. Doesn't make sense. Okay. Soft logic, again, as Adam mentioned, resources. If I know I have limited resources and they should go from this building to this building, that's soft logic I should reflect in my schedule after applying the hard logic. And eventually, our last is any phasing requirement, contractually required phasing, again, should be reflected after the hard logic. The types of relationships. So we discussed the categories, the 3 categories, the mandatory, hard logic, soft logic. The types of relationship, regardless which software you're using, are generally 4 types. Start to start, finish to finish, finish to start, and start to finish. Again, relationships are added for the CPM method to be effective. The schedule has to function as a complete network. For this to happen, every activity should have at least 1 predecessor and 1 successor. In other words, don't leave any activity open-ended from its predecessor side or successor side. Why? Because it functions all together. Any delay in each of these activities would affect the paths, and I would see any upcoming risk that I might face. Okay. General consideration, the start to finish relationship is a no-no in most specifications. The start to finish relationship basically says that the predecessor cannot finish. The predecessor cannot finish except when the successor starts. There are very minimal applications for this relationship in construction, and therefore it's prohibited in all the federal sites. It's prohibited, and it's not a good practice. Don't use it unless you have a very solid explanation for it. The start to start, finish to finish. So construction falls between the finish to start and the start to start, finish to finish. Finish to start is self-explanatory. Something starts after the predecessor finishes. Start to start, finish to finish, many activities falls within this category. If I'm doing a slab and I'm setting up formwork and then installing my reinforcement, I would start my reinforcement 5 days after I start the formwork. That's the start to start relationship. And my reinforcement would finish 5 days after the formwork is completed. That's the finish to finish. So in general, when applying the relationships, any start to start, most of the cases, 95% of the cases, would require a finish to finish. Don't set a start to start to an activity with no finish to finish. And why is that? Because if you set an activity linked by their start dates, and then let's say these 2 activities, and then this activity, the one floor activity is linked with a finish to start, the first activity could be delayed forever without delaying anything. It doesn't have a successor. It's only linked with its start dates. And we'll go through this in the scheduling errors. The overall point is don't apply any start to start relationship without a finish to finish unless that's what will happen, and you have a very proper explanation for it. Leads and lags. Leads is mostly applicable in a start to start, finish to finish relationship. Again, it will start 3 days afterwards. That's a lead that you should reflect. Similar to the start to finish, the lags. The first one I mentioned is the lags. This should start 3 days after. That's a lag, not a lead. The start to finish, the lead is very similar to it. It basically gives the successor a higher priority than the predecessor, and that's why it's not a better practice. So generally speaking, use all the relationships, use the lags, stay away from the start to finish and the leads. And any start to start relationship should have a finish to finish.
Are there any questions on that? That's one area of scheduling that can be a little bit.
Are you guys following the overall?
Conceptualized, so if you got questions, guys, just.
We're almost there, and we'll take a break afterwards.
You said a start to start always has to have finish to finish.
Yes. I'm sorry?
A start to start, you do that, you have to always have a
Yes.
finish to finish, you can't have a finish to start.
A finish to start would be for the successor activity. So if you have two activities, this is tied to, this is predecessor and successor, and they are linked by start to start, finish to finish. This activity, the second activity, is tied to the successor with a finish to start if possible. But, I don't know. Go.
Yeah, because that doesn't. Trying to set that cabinet right there.
What?
There you go. Go use that. That's permanent. Look at the
So it's fixed in the
Yeah, look at
that. Okay.
Sure, we got lacquer, then that'll take it off.
Okay.
Take out the whiteboard too.
Is this for paper or is that?
I think that's
It's a whiteboard, right?
Find out.
I don't know if you guys see it over here. Okay, so that's activity A, that's activity B, that's the predecessor, and that's the successor. Start to start relationship. Let's say this activity B is linked with a finish to start with this activity, which is activity C, okay? So now I've tied them with a start to start with no finish to finish. And activity B is linked with a finish to start. And if this activity is tied with a finish to start, for example, activity A does have a predecessor and does have a successor, right? So it's not open-ended. And activity B has a predecessor and has a successor. But if activity A got delayed by whichever number of days, does it affect anything? Is it tied to anything? No, it's not. So that is considered an open logic. So most of the softwares would not show this as an open logic, or an open-end logic, but it is, because regardless how many days it gets delayed, it doesn't affect anything.
Well, where does the finish to finish relation go?
It goes here.
But doesn't it extend that, doesn't it extend the duration of that?
You
No.
would pull B out in
No,
the
Pull
A
B.
in the later.
Let's start with a 5 days lag, which means with 5 day lag, 10 days.
Yeah, but in your dashed line example on the top, it would pull B out.
Yeah, if it got delayed, it will pull B out.
It has to have that
And
relationship.
then B will pull C out.
But that's not gonna show activity A now taking 15 days.
If it got delayed by 5 days,
If it finished on time,
if it finished on time,
yeah,
Okay.
but with that logic tie, it would not show it as now a 15-day activity because it's linked as a finish to finish with B.
how would it show at a 15 days if it finished on time?
We don't.
Like
But
if
if
it
it's not that finish to finish activity, you're saying A can't finish till B.
no, finish to finish, A is the predecessor. A should finish 5 days ahead of B.
B can't.
So B cannot finish except, yeah, let's say that's the forward,
Yes.
and that's the RFT. Okay, the RFT should start 5 days after the start of the forward, it should finish 5 days. Okay, so that's why in very rare cases would you apply a start to start with no finish to finish. In most of construction, the drywall, it's all the studs and then the panels, it's a start to start, finish to finish. You cannot, if you cannot start except when the predecessor starts, most probably you cannot finish except when the predecessor finishes. Most probably.
So would that be the same if you tied a finish to start from A to C?
If you tie it like this,
Yeah.
without a finish to finish, then it's not an open end, and it is applicable. But no, but one thing you have to take into consideration: activity B, does activity A has to finish before activity B finishes or not?
Right.
If the answer is yes, then you have to link it,
Yeah.
even if it's linked to a finish with a finish to start. Okay, so any activity that has a start-to-start relationship with a predecessor, can it finish before the predecessor would finish? In most cases, the answer is no, and therefore they have to be tied. Simply because if this gets delayed and it's not tied with the finish to finish, it wouldn't show any delay here. Right? Yeah. So that's why, as a correct logic, it has to be tied both ways. And it's a correct logic, and again, if it's not tied this way and activity A got delayed forever, it wouldn't show any effect on schedule. It's not functioning as a network.
I think when we're building our schedules, NASA, the template that we set up has a predecessor successor column on it. it's pretty easy to tell if the tide isn't linked to something because there's not a number in that column.
There are, in P6 and ASTA, there are specific filters that capture this,
Right.
that would separate the activities that are open-ended with a start-to-start, finish relationship. And, I'm sorry?
You can ask this specifically for the column, your predecessors will start, to finish to finish tie to a successor, or is it, you in a predecessor column, you put 5 start 3 days, and on the 5 start finish to finish 3 days. You same column that, so
It's gonna say like.
is the
I
finish
don't
to
think
finish,
that's
is the finish to finish link a predecessor or a successor? The day doesn't finish, the finish to finish link is successor.
If he doesn't finish, he wouldn't. So finish to finish is a predecessor. Both start to start and finish to finish is a,
Both be the predecessor.
yes. Both predecessor to activity B. Both predecessor to activity B. Okay. Again, always take the formwork as an example. The formwork governs the reinforcement for the slab. The reinforcement cannot start except 3 days after the formwork, and it cannot finish except 3 days after the formwork. So, okay. So, last thing in a relationship are constraints. As I mentioned, too many constraints messes up the schedule, messes everything about the CPM. You can never read a float, you can never extract path. So, as a very best practice, utilize only one constraint in your schedule, which is the last activity or the project completion. Everything should be tied and feeding up to the project completion, so that when any activity gets delayed, the effect is represented on the project completion. Unless, this rule is applicable unless it's specified by the contract that phase 1 should be completed on 17th of March, 2021. Then I would have a constraint on phase 1, because that's a contract requirement. But if it's not contractually required, then don't apply constraints at all. Even though if you agreed with the client that, yeah, this should be finished in 3 weeks, and that's a hard date, and you're planning your progress on it, it's not a contractual constraint. So don't apply the constraint except if it's contractual or the project completion, and that's one very necessary rule to have it functioning as a network.
So if you have multiple tasks, like we have on our project, I know this is a question, but we have an interim milestone, we have to hit a turnover milestone on specific floors before the project's done. We have 2 constraints.
This turnover is a contract requirements, is it specified by your contract?
We have to finish this one in 550 days and this one in 500.
Then it's contractual. Then this is a constraint. Yeah. If it's in a contract, it's a constraint. If it's required by the contract specific duration or date, it's a constraint. If not, then don't apply constraint. You can apply it internally, like internally as a date. Guys, we need to finish this. And add a milestone in your schedule, finishing level 1 of MEPs. Add it in the contract in your schedule, but don't constrain it. And you know the date, compare it each month and see where you're at, but don't constrain it.
Our constraint is to finish on it before. So
Yeah.
it allows us to go behind, but not, we don't use the hard constraint to start or finish on it.
Well, finish on or before, start on or before. There is a mandatory start, mandatory finish. These are the hard constraints. We never use these, but the finish on or before is the most logical to apply a constraint. Okay. Okay, we're almost there. We created activities, we applied durations, we tied them up, we have a logical network, we have everything set up. What's the following step? Following step is taking into account the work periods or the calendars. I will start off from downwards, which is an example to give you a feel of how impactful not applying the correct calendar can be. So if you have a 20 work day activity, that will take 20 work days. This activity, if I applied 5-day calendar on it, would take 28 actual days. If I applied a 6-day calendar on it, would take 23 actual days. If I applied a weather calendar on it, can take up to 35 actual days. So a 20-day activity, depending on the calendar, can take up from 20 days to 35 days. Apply this on all the activities, its impact is very significant. That's why it's very important to apply the proper calendars depending on the type of activity. an activity. If you have a weather activity for an outside activity, apply it on it. Interior would have a different. If you work 6 days, then it's a 6-day calendar. 5 days is 5-day calendar. Apply all the federal holidays. If you don't work on it, apply the weekends. If the client has specific requirements or days off that he instructs you to shut off the site, reflect that. Activities are very crucial for reflecting a realistic schedule. Generally, we have three types of activities. A workday activity, that's the most common, whether it's a 5-day calendar, three types of calendars. A workday calendar, that's the most common, whether it's a 5-day calendar, 6-day, depending on your project. 7-day calendar, procurement, for example, if something is being shipped and it's taking 2 months, it wouldn't stop on a weekend in the middle of the sea, just like because, so it has to have a 7-day calendar. Same thing for submittals. Usually in our case, the submitter review the 30 calendar days, regardless of what holidays or weekends are on. We count calendar days, which is the actual days. Third is the weather calendar. That's applicable to the outdoors. That takes into account any anticipated adverse weather. Speaking of the weather, this is a self-study, so go through it, but I'll speak briefly about it. Most of the specifications have an anticipated or allowable number of weather days per year or per month or per project. So you have to take these number of days in account when setting your plan. And there are 3 ways in general to do this. I wouldn't go in detail through how to reflect it. Anyone's interested, you can reach out to me and we can go in details, but either way is to reflect this in your original plan. What's very important is that you log the weather daily, how severe it is, have a daily log of the adverse weather, the days that you couldn't work on. If a heavy rain and you had to clear the site the next day because of the rain, that's considered an adverse weather. Log it daily and submit a monthly weather log to the client. This month, we had anticipated number of days of 5 days. We had 10 actual adverse weather days. During these weather days, we had these critical activities ongoing, and therefore the project has been impacted beyond the allowable or anticipated by 5 days. This should be a note or a written note that's sent to the client on a monthly basis. Just this month we had X amount of days more than allowable, and so on. And then annually, periodically, at the end of the project, sum it all up and claim for it if the project is behind, because they are entitled for these variances. Just notify them monthly, and then at the very end, okay, throughout, these are the logs, we've notified you, we couldn't work, these are the impacted critical activities, and we want these days, just adding them up.
Can you talk about which of those 3 items is what you
Any of them, yes. Well,
we have an answer to that. What do we?
Yes,
All I've done is I've always done the cycle.
yeah, very well.
the buffer activity,
That's what we're trying, most of the contract negotiations, we try to get an agreement with the owner on a set number of days. And we have that agreed upon number of days, it's an activity at the end of the schedule for us to finish completion, and that way it's clearly tracked. If we lose days and we're sending notices, we reduce the number remaining. And that way we're not debating at some later point after the delay of what we should have anticipated for normal weather for the area.
each of these methods has its pros and cons. Like for the buffer, for example, when the product gets delayed in general, does it eat up from this buffer?
Only for weather, only for weather.
So you eat it up only for weather. What if it exceeded the adverse? So you have 20 days anticipated for contract duration, and throughout the contract or midway through the contract you have 25. How would you reflect that?
It would be reflecting the progress of the activities that were delayed. They would take longer than the original duration. They were critical path, would extend your end date past your milestone, and that's the duration you claim to your clients. You basically reset your milestone dates, whatever the weather caused. That's how we're doing it.
Reset. Tell me again.
So if the milestone was, let's say it's June 1st, and I had a weather day that made my projected finish date with no concurrent delays June 2nd, I would submit a change order to the client that says my new day is June 2nd. And I would move my constraint flag to June 2nd to say that all activities that finished before that milestone are now done. I gave myself a day for it.
Has been impacted.
That's how I have that.
I would need to see it in details because again, first, if you have concurrent delays. Second, if the impacted activities were not weather,
They weren't critical that I couldn't claim it. That's kind of how it works. So if it rains and I can still do the activities that are zero flow, I didn't incur.
okay, okay,
Right.
okay.
We can look at that tomorrow.
Yeah, yeah, I'll do this.
We do have, we've got somebody from the Phoenix group that's watching alongside the operative comments from Mike Maluski. He says, best practice for my former employer has been to use a buffer activity for a specific calendar duration, or excuse me, for a specific duration. When using a weather calendar, it is hidden. Sometimes if the weather day does not occur, it is difficult to accelerate the following trades. The buffer activity keeps everyone scheduled as early as possible, and you monitor the weather delays as they occur. So, there's, some different
Yes,
approaches that
and
are available.
in our case,
That's why I asked.
and in our case, it directs us to use a calendar. And
I asked the question.
okay,
You're my little corner.
let's take a look at it tomorrow in details. But one thing I want to point out is that P6 doesn't have a buffer activity. It has a hammock, which doesn't act as a buffer in ASTA.
We don't call it a buffer activity. It's literally an activity with a duration. Reduce the duration.
Oh, but ASTA does have a buffer activity, right?
I have no idea. I've never
Yeah, it does. It does.
We use an actual activity.
Okay.
Duration. We just reduce it. So if we said 10 days of weather, the activity duration was 10 days. As we incur the day, it's now 987. So the idea is the progress.
Has you incurred any days beyond the anticipated or any days? Period.
And once we get to run out, we have the whole issue afterward.
Okay, so what my question would be, what happens when you run out of the days?
So I have an activity here, and this is my end date. As the progress of the work, the critical path with the weather day activities in the critical path, right?
Okay, so you ate up your entire weather.
Right, so I'm gonna pull my end date's here, the weather day is here. As I incur, what would happen is my end date would go out. I'm
Yeah.
marking the face. So I come this way. So when I run out of days, I'm now here. My weather day is now 0 days. Now I'm just tracking the progress, and that's me submitting it to the client, saying my contractual date was this. We had a weather day on this day. It cost us 1 working day. I'm now asking you for 1 more day.
Okay, and you do this for any days beyond the anticipated, the originally anticipated.
You do it for every day, actually.
We track all the days, so there's no argument about, well, you said 10 days, we think you only had 7.
Okay.
Every time we have a weather delay, it's usually documented within 24 hours of the client. And then as we eat up our activity duration, we get to 0.
Retire.
Well, then you have to modify all the weather.
Yeah. Personally, from a personal experience, my best preference would be to add a like, let's say your anticipated weather is 10 days a year and the project is 3 years, so it's 30 days. Divide the 30 by the overall duration, and you have a percentage. Apply this percentage to the weather impacted activities in general, and then follow the reporting method to claim for your time. So you just add it as a buffer duration for the weather activities, and then each month submit this report. That's the anticipated per month if it's per month, or per year if it's per year, versus the actual. These are the activities. When these stuff happens, when these adverse weather days happens, and these are the critical activities, and we're claiming for the assumptions.
Spell out your assumptions or something.
Yeah. And in the documentation, we add a log of each of these weather days and what activities has been impacted by it. Not to go through the whole hassle of buffer activity, because now you can have this buffer activity on your longest path. We'll go through it in details, but I think the best practice is just like to add a buffer duration and then submit it as a report, monthly report or bi-monthly or whatever, and claim for it as you move forward. Okay. After you've applied the calendars, review the overall path is, okay, now you have your baseline almost completed. You just want to verify what's in it. Verify the durations, verifies the crews that you estimated this durations and logic on matches what you have as a corporate or matches what you estimated on this project. Review the logic and most importantly, review the overall float that you have. Again, I mentioned the excessive and minimal float in the common mistakes. Many schedules fall within these two categories. So how to define whether your project has an excessive float or a minimal float. And again, an excessive float, that means you didn't plan it, didn't apply any soft logic. You just like left all the paths hanging to happen whenever it happens. There's no cruise dependencies, there's no phases dependencies, there's no spanning across the construction period. And that's an excessive. Minimal is being very aggressive. I will just like do everything in sequence. I will use 2 guys throughout the entire project to perform the entire project. I wouldn't have more than this. That is very aggressive. So the minimum, most probably it's unachievable, most probably, and the excessive, there is a lack in plan. So the excessive float, according to the couple of publications I've been through, if the average float is higher than 20% of the contract duration, the average float for your project is higher than 20% of the contract duration, that's an excessive float. For the minimum float, if the average float is less than 5% of the contract duration, that's your limit for a minimal and an excessive. And either ways, it's a common sense. Like go through your project and go through the paths. Is it logically tied? Does it make sense to pull where it is or not?
Average float, not sure.
I'm sorry?
Say average float. What do you mean?
Average.
So if I take the total float of all the activities
In average,
the number of activities,
yeah.
that's the average.
Yeah.
Is there an auto calculation?
I guess I don't know how to calculate what my average float is.
No, just paste it in Excel and average the float for the activities, for the construction activities. Filter the construction, paste it in Excel, average, just like Excel average the float and compare it to the overall duration. But I want to emphasize more that instead of doing this, go through the logic and see if it makes sense. Are the paths connected logically? Does this path, can I add any more work here, any similar work? I have a couple of pavements spread out throughout the project. They're not tied together. Why they're not tied together? Link them together. Just this step is a common sense step. Go through the passes, see if they are tied properly or not according to your plan. The minimal float, or regardless of the minimum float, the critical activities, filter the critical activities, and they should not exceed. They should not be more than 20% of the activities should the critical and near critical should not exceed 20% of the total number of activities you have in a schedule. Otherwise, it will be somewhat aggressive to achieve. You will have a critical path, but the more critical activities you have, the harder is it to maintain and achieve this schedule. Last is the coding or categorization. As I mentioned, I wouldn't go through all the codes, but the most important of them is the responsibility code, assigning the responsibility subcontractor. If it's self-performed, it's the client. Whoever is going to perform this activity, the activity has to have a code with this party. It has many applications, some of which is extracting the scope for each subcontractor monthly and compare it to the previous month to see how they are performing, each subcontractor separately. Other than this, we have billing. If you're billing through the schedule with a simple click, you can extract each subcontractor billing from your own schedule. And for the variances, for the trends analysis, all these stuff, you want to break it down by subcontractor to know who's performing and who's not. That's why it's very important. Last step in the schedule development is sanity check. After you've done all of these previous This is our baseline. This is what you agreed on. This is what's in your subcontract as a duration and logic, and this is what we will be measuring your performance against. It's very important. Break time. Do you guys have any questions for this section, for the schedule development activities, WBS, any of these, please?
So we use the main process, obviously.
The what?
I'll come up.
Okay.
Our Zoom meeting got, it just kicked off about a minute ago.
Really?
And then it came back up, just for literally for the last slide.
Is it still recording?
I think it's recording. And to figure out what
You're right.
protection requirements.
Here's another one.
All right, guys, we're going to get started with the next couple of sections of the presentation. So we understand that that first section there was primarily a review for a lot of you guys. You've been exposed to the basic scheduling, logical relationships, and things like that. What we really wanted to do is just reinforce the best practices so that we avoid the kinds of pitfalls that we see when best practices are set aside. We're going to go through the schedule maintenance portion here as well. This also is going to be in line with what you're accustomed to for standard practices. We want to reinforce those to make sure that it's sticking and that it's fresh in your mind. Even if you're generally aware of it, it's always good to be reminded of the best practices so that you can refresh on some of the things that might not be at the forefront of your thinking. Beyond that, like I mentioned at the beginning, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about general change management and how we can use the schedule to support that process. After that, Dowie has a nice section on schedule analysis that really highlights some of the more advanced aspects of scheduling and how we can use the software to really improve our efficiencies, how we can extract key indicators to tell us where we are at any given point in the project and how we can use that information to make real-time decisions and how to adjust so that if we're off in any area, or if we need to make decisions, we're informed by actual data and not just a kind of a gut check feel. So that's kind of the second half of what we're going to work on here. We'll get through as much as we can. The question and answers, that makes the entire experience much better. So if you've got something and you're kind of waiting for a pause to get in there, don't wait. Either throw your hand up and he'll finish the sentence and call on you, or just get in there and ask the questions, because it really brings the overall experience to life. So
Okay. So now we have our baseline and we're doing the updates. First of all, I want to go through what happens when an activity progresses. The baseline, all the data we have for all the activities, we call like plain data. That's what we plan. So what changes in an activity once it starts or progresses? Generally, there are 4 aspects of each activity that changes once it starts. That's the 4 aspects of, or the 4 main features of any activity, and that's what changes once it starts progression. First are the days and durations. Second is the physical quantities. Each activity has a quantity of how many units have been completed versus the total quantity for the activity. Third, the cost or revenue if applied to these activities. Fourth are the resources, again, if applied. I wouldn't go through the cost and revenue and resource in this presentation. We added a section, I don't know if we'll have time to go through it, just to show you the benefits, how you can benefit from your schedules if you apply these the costs and the resources on it. Okay, so these 4 features or attributes of an activity, for a baseline, it has a planned data. Once activity starts, these planned data changes to 3 main items. The planned data changes to an actual data, what happened during the progress period, and the remaining, and what we call the at completion. And usually the actual plus the remaining equal the at completion, but when things varies, the at completion data, which could be durations, quantities, cost, revenue, varies from the overall plan. So for duration, for example, if I planned a 10 days activity, and once an activity started, it took 4 days, like 4 days have been consumed, and then the following update, I found that it took 15 more days, so the overall duration is 19. The at completion duration is 19 days versus the plan, which is 10 days. The actual remaining at completion for each of these four, when we divide the actual by at completion, we start to get percentages. And therefore, for each activity, we have 4 types of percentages. We have duration percent complete, physical percent complete, cost percent, and unit percent, which is the resources. Each of them represent a kind of progress for an activity, and we'll be going through which percentage is preferred to be used when measuring overall progress. Again, I'm not talking about cost loading, but the physical quantity, the physical percent and the cost percent, when they are merged together, we come up with something called the performance percent complete. And this will be demonstrated in the benefits of cost loading. That's the most accurate representation for progress. That's mixing the cost or revenue that you have and the physical quantities into one percentage. And this is so much related to the earned value methodologies. Again, wouldn't be talking about it, but I have the benefits of it in a separate section. Okay, for doing an update, I'm sure all of you, or most of you have done an update before. I'll go through the overall logical steps for it and what we'll be covering in these sections versus what's included in the upcoming sections. First step in performing an update is simply collecting the as-built for each and every update, for each and every activity. And we've talked about what changes in an activity. So I want to know the actual data for the activities, the remaining data for it, and the at completion. So collecting as-built, that's the first thing. Second step, and this will be discussed in section D, is checking for changes, applying the change management methodology that we'll be presenting in section D. Anything that have changed in the project, either an impact, added scope, any changes at all, going through it and capture these changes to be reflected in my progress update. Third, gathering these stuff and putting it in my software. Any software, ASA, P6, MS Project, plugging these data into the software to get the update. After adding it in the software, and we'll be discussing this in a minute, apply the quality checks, and we'll be going through what are these quality checks and how do we apply it in our softwares. So plug it in the software, make sure the software captures the data that you collected and captures the actual status of the project. What do we do after we do our quality checks? We analyze the update. Now we have a proper schedule, doesn't have any errors. It captures all the data for this month, for example. Let's analyze it. Let's see what changed, what happened, what are the variances, how did my longest path change, what are my flow paths, what are my priorities in the project other than the longest path, and many other stuff that we'll be discussing, hopefully in section F, which is schedule analysis. After I've analyzed the schedule, now I know what issues I have. So I've gathered the data, I've analyzed it, I know what has been delayed and how much has been delayed, who's responsible for it, how I've been performing versus my original plan, and I have these old data from the analysis. Afterwards, this is a very important step, meet with the stakeholders, have a monthly meeting with subcontractors, all the project team, and discuss what have you concluded from the schedule analysis. Guys, these paths have been delayed. These activities have been delayed. We were projecting X amount of progress the last month, and we only performed this amount. And go through the reasons why these happened, who's responsible for it, and go into as much details in the stakeholder meetings to identify the causes for the delays or variances, and then start to come up with a plan to how to mitigate or recover from these, or even change the plan entirely. So when you meet with the stakeholders, and this is what they call the pool planning or the last planner method, you go through the schedule analysis and either you agree on the upcoming plan for the next period of time, or you found out that there were a lot of variances and stuff that happened during the last period that needs a revision. So out of this meeting, you have one or two passes. Either that, oh, we need to apply some mitigation efforts. We need to recover from the delays that happened. We need to change the plan because stuff happened during the last period. And then you have to get back here and start to reflect the new plan in the software, run your errors, do the analysis, and come up with the new plan. After we come up with a new plan, if there are issues from the analysis, you meet again with the stakeholders. Okay, after plotting, after adding this new plan that we agreed on in the software, these issues happened, and start addressing it again. This is a continuous process until you, okay, that's no issues. That's the plan for moving forward for the next periodic update, and then you go to extracting the control schedule. If you would recall from the third slide, the 5 levels of schedule, you go to extracting the 2 or 3 or 6 weeks look ahead, however you do it, from your CPM schedules, and then distribute it to sites. And that's how would you be managing your scope throughout the next period. Last but not least, after you do the whole thing, document the update, put it all in so extract all the reports and put it all in one package and archive it, so you would have it in a database for any of the reasons that we'll be discussing. Okay, first step for we discussed is collecting the as-builts. And as I mentioned, what changes? So what are the as-builts that we'll be collecting? Simply for durations and dates, we need to know the actual start dates or the actual duration for each activity, the projected completion for each activity, or the remaining duration. That's for the duration. The quantities, how much units have been completed and how much units remaining. And these are the type of data that I will be collecting each update. Ideally, the 4% should be equal. In a perfect world, the duration, the amount completed, 20% of the activity or 20% of the quantity completed in 20% of the time with 20% of the resources and 20% of the cost, but that never happens. And that's why we have to, because things doesn't fall in line, we have to collect the actual separate from the remaining. We don't subtract the actual from the planned to come up with the remaining. And that's a very common mistake that we discussed that provides a false remaining durations. For example, if I apply this for the remaining durations, I have a planned duration and it took me 3 days, regardless how much I've completed in these 3 days, 10 minus 3 is 7, that's wrong. I have to see and I have to capture how much I've completed in these 3 days and reflect this production in the remaining durations.
Wait, can you stop there for a second?
Sure.
Because I think that happens all the time on every job.
Yeah, it does.
And I think part of the reason it happens is because, as we're distributing, we're doing weekly updates here.
Okay.
So when we're doing a weekly update and we do a 6-week look ahead and, following the last planner process, we're sending that to the subcontractors. They're supposed to do weekly work planning based on that. So as that information is going to the subs, the subcontractors, they kind of use it to their advantage. So if we show a longer remaining duration based on what they've actually produced to date, they take that as, oh, now I have more time. Mm-hmm. And so that's the constant inner conversation and struggle with how do we keep the subs, hold them responsible to finish as soon as we can get them to finish while still doing good schedule management practices.
If that's the case, then I would reflect the remaining duration that I want to commit them to and discuss it in the meeting. So guys, this activity, 40% of the duration have been consumed and you only completed 10%. That means you're meeting 1x of the productivity we agreed on. Moving forward, I didn't change the remaining duration. I've left the same. Actually, you should meet a higher production to meet the same remaining duration, and you'll be obliged to meet this production for the next period of time. And then on the following meeting, you'll be reviewing this remaining duration versus what you agreed on, and you'll start capturing these variances and putting it together to come up with a trend for this subcontractor. Is he performing according to the plan or not? Is this variance a one-time thing, or that's the overall trend of this subcontractor throughout his entire activity or throughout his entire scope? So it should, if that's the case, leave it as is, but highlighted significantly in the meeting with subcontractor. I left it as is because you have to push up your productivity. You have to add more people to meet the original remaining duration, because I would not revise my duration according to your production. You have to meet the durations.
That issue is really the first indicator of a delay and a problem.
Yep.
And the main reason I wanted this training to happen was to better manage those delays, better tracking, better documentation of it if we get into a claim situation and all that. So just want to make sure we're all understanding the best way to manage that. Maybe there's more to come and what you've got in the material. With delays.
We will be discussing the specifically in the full planning. We'll be discussing what needs to be highlighted during these stuff. I'm just going through the process of getting an update, and in the analysis, we'll be focusing a lot on the variances and how to deal with it, how to address it, how to document it, and how to monitor it throughout the updates. Okay, so again, the actuals should be collected separately from the remaining, unless this is the case, and I want to keep the remaining duration as is and push up my productions. But generally, if I'm performing and I found out that my self-performing or the subcontractor cannot meet the original production or the original productivities, their remaining duration should be revised to reflect the new production rate that's on site. Okay, speaking of percentages, many softwares utilize the duration percent complete, and it is, I would easily say, it's the least accurate measure for an activity, because simply when 30% of the duration, when 30% of the activity duration is consumed, doesn't mean that he performed 30% of the activity. There is a quantity. Each activity has a quantity. How much he actually performed represents the actual progress for this activity. And this is reflected in the physical percent, not the duration percent. The problem with the physical percent is that it cannot be summarized on a project level, because simply each activity has different units. So how are you gonna unify the unit to come up with the overall physical percent for the project? And that's when the earned value comes in handy, because you quantify each activity regardless of its unit in a cost value and then apply it. But either ways, the overall physical percent complete should match your billing percent complete, regardless. Even if you're not cost-loading the schedule, eventually you're billing according to the actual quantities or the actual physical quantity of work performed for each project. So generally, it should be matching. And if the project was cost-loaded, the performance percent complete in most cases matches up with the billing percent complete. The physical percent complete, as I mentioned, should be calculated based on how much of the activity, how many units have been completed versus the overall units for each activity. If no activities were available, and that's the case only when no activities are available, then a rough estimate should be applied for the activity completion. If you know in general, I have 10 rooms I'm installing light fixtures and I've finished 2 rooms, then it's 20% complete. I don't have to go through the quantities for the actual light fixtures. But if you have quantities, definitely quantities is a way more accurate, better practice to come up with the actual percentage. The exact actual dates should be reflected. The exact actual dates, not an estimate. This is very crucial in case of any conflict or dispute in the future. So all the as-built stuff, what's left on a data date has to reflect exactly what happened with the most accurate dates as possible, because again, in any delay analysis, it comes in very handy. Oh, sorry. Okay, the overall steps for collecting as-built, there are no much details here, except that the as-built in general should be included in the daily logs. So the daily logs should reference activity IDs with dates. So this activity in each day, and it's a tough practice, but when it gets applied properly, it's very handy, and it governs that you'll have a really realistic projection and as-built data in your schedule. So, and for the daily logs, it should include it should reference activities names, IDs with actual dates, actual quantities if possible, if resources, actual hours, and then with accounting actual cost if you have cost on it. But the as-built in general should be included in the daily logs. That's way better than having to open up your notes and going through the pictures for each project monthly to get a rough estimate for when this activity starts because you don't recall, and then reflecting around date. Same thing for the duration and definitely the quantity. So as much as possible, include the as-built data in the daily log for each periodic update. Gather up the daily logs for the period of time and go through these IDs and activities and reflect that on the schedule. And as I mentioned, remaining durations in general should not be estimated based on the planned durations. It should be estimated based on your actual productivity on site. After you collect the as-built data from the daily logs, a walkthrough has to be performed to validate what's been collected. So you would have a log with activities and the actual dates, percentages. Do a walkthrough to make sure that these percentages, what you're seeing inside, reflect these percentages before you would plug it in into your software. Okay, we've collected the as-built data. Now, the following step is to add these data into the software. Before adding any as-built data into the software, you have to assign a baseline. What is assign a baseline? Before you change the update, and it's the same P6 or ASTA, before you change the update, create an image or a baseline schedule from the current update. So you'll be able to measure the variance between the schedule after you updated from when, with the one before it gets updated. So either way, ASTA or P6, create a schedule baseline and assign it to the update before applying the as-built. There are 4 main categories that the activities fall in. I wouldn't go in detail through it. If an activity in progress, for example, and finished, what kind of data should be collected for it? An activity that hasn't started and finished, what kind of data should be collected for it? And the steps of applying these as-built data into the software. After plugging in the actual data in the software, you run a quality check. What is a quality check? There are many stuff that happens when you apply the as-built data into an update. An example of which is an out of sequence, for example, stuff that happened out of sequence and you plugged it into the software. Other example will be that you changed some sort of logic that concluded into a loop sequence, something like activity A feed B, C, D, and then D feed A as well. Many scheduling errors that the software, both P6 and ASTA, has a tool to identify and extract, and we'll be going through these errors, and I've included in the following slides an overall software-related steps to extract this scheduling error report for P6 and ASTA separately. So the errors in general, first is anything against the recommendations we provided into the schedule development, the float or the overall durations for the activities. Second is, most importantly, the out of sequence activities. Third is checking for any open-ended activities, and that includes the start to start with no finish to finish, as we mentioned. Fourth is the actual dates. So, and that's only a P6 related error. If you set an actual date for an activity that goes beyond the data date, ASTA wouldn't allow you to do this, but P6 would, and it will show up in the error log, as you will see. Checking for loop sequencing, that's something related to ASTA and not the P6. If you have a loop sequence, P6 wouldn't allow you to schedule your project, but ASTA would, and again, it would show up into your log report, as we would see. Last thing is the constraint activity. Make sure you don't have any constraints, as we mentioned, except the last activity. Okay, the following are, I wouldn't go through them. Again, these are steps to extract the error report from ASTA, the overall steps. And once you schedule your project, an error report will be extracted, and I'll present that in a second, how it looks like. Same thing for the P6, what to do, how to create the log, and how it is categorized that shows these errors that you have to fix before you would finalize the schedule. That's a sample for the error report from the P6, as you see, like out of sequence activities, and they list them down by ID, activities without successor, activities without a predecessor, actual dates greater than the data dates. Same thing for ASTA. Activity in the link loop, open-ended, task with no outgoing links, out-of-sequence activities, all these stuff are included in a report that the software generates. Out of sequence. So out of sequence, simply it's considered an invalid relationship, something that happened on site that differs from the original plan I had. An example for that activity that had, let me illustrate it here. So I have activity A and activity B that's tied with a finish to start relationship. Okay, if what happened on site, and that happens all the time during the logic, activity B started before activity A would finish. The P6 or the ASTA would still have them linked as a finish to start. Once you plug in your actual dates, and run the schedule, it will show up in the log as an out of sequence error. Why? Because this relation is not applicable anymore. So how to solve a situation like that? You have to see what actually happened inside. In most cases, this relation has to be deleted and changed to start or finish to finish. Why is the out of sequence is a big deal? Like what if I left it like this? What would happen? What would happen is, so I have this activity A, and then activity B, and activity B started somewhere here. If that's the data date, the software would push activity B, the remaining portion of activity B, to start after activity A, and therefore this duration showing showing nothing when actually activity B will be ongoing because it already started and will progress as activity A starts. So apply this on a couple of activities, then it will mess up your flow. It would push activities and show dates for activities that's not applicable, or show false dates, and moreover, this could be applicable on a complete path. So if I have a bunch of activities like this and then linked on another path, and then this path started here, for example, it should fall in like this. If I didn't solve this simple out of sequence, the software would push these activities to start after path 1 completion. So it could be applicable on an entire path. The out of sequence, if it's not resolved, it could push an entire path to fall according to the original sequence, even though it already started and will progress throughout the next updates. So again, it messes up the flow calculation. You don't have to go in details on how it affects, but just know that it messes up the flow calculation, the longest path, and it could affect the flow patterns or the priorities in your schedule. Again, that's something, a self-study. These are options that you should apply either in ASTA or P6 or the software to capture the out of sequence. If these were not applied in ASTA, it would not capture the out of sequence. These are not applied in P6, it would not capture the out of sequence. These are examples for the out of sequence in general. So a lag that has not been met, or finish to start that started ahead, a start to start that started ahead, and so on, and a general recommendation for how to solve these out of sequence. Again, that's a general recommendation. The governing rule for solving an out of sequence is identifying the out of sequence and then seeing on site what actually happened, why this out of sequence happened, and reflecting what happened on site into this relation. If it started ahead because it truly is a start to start relationship, not a finish to start, then this should be reflected. Whatever happened on site should be reflected to solve the out of sequence, not just applying a theoretical methods similar to these to solve it without having a realistic case that you solve it on. Another form of a scheduling error is the open ends, and we've discussed it. I think we went through it plenty. Not just an open end activity that doesn't have a successor or predecessor. A start to start with no finish to finish is considered an open end. and we'll discuss this. To capture these kind of relations, a specific filters have to be applied, and a specific filter has to be applied in either P6 or ASTA, and more easily it could be done via Excel if you would include the predecessor and successor. If anyone's interested, either tomorrow or anytime, we can go in detail through this, how to identify the open ends that have start with no finish to finish relationship. This is a sample for scheduled error log. There are plenty of softwares that identifies these errors, and the ASTA P6 identified most of them. And the new ASTA, I don't know if you guys have it, but when you do, it have a very new cool feature called quality check or scheduled quality check. Just run it, and it will run the analysis of all your scheduled components to identify these stuff with the IDs, so you'll be able to fix it. If not, it could be done manually on Excel. Or again, there are plenty of softwares online. Okay. After reviewing after applying the quality check and making sure the data is plugged into the software, and now it functions as a proper logic network with no errors. Before reviewing it, if you would recall the overall steps, you have to go through the analysis and apply the steps for analysis that we'll be discussing onto the schedule before reviewing it with the stakeholders. So you have to attend this meeting with a predetermined issues that happened during the previous periods, identify the specific activities that's been delayed, why it's been delayed, and then discuss it with the stakeholders. So generally, it's very important to have this meeting with each periodic update to review what happened and apply any mitigation or apply the necessary actions to rectify the schedule. Overall outcomes of this meeting, you should be able to revise the next period plan if needed. Again, break down the updates that you performed until 2, 3, 6 weeks. Look ahead, a day by day, which is the full planning of the last planner. Assign or reassign responsibilities for the daily tasks, so you'd be able to monitor it, and every subcontractor, every party would know what task he has on a day-by-day basis. And then get the subcontractors buy-in and commitment to the daily plan, not just a monthly, to a day-by-day tasks. That is usually done. Revising the plan and breaking it down is usually It's usually applied through a last planner method. I wouldn't go through steps by steps. I will discuss it generally. Simply, it's the most important thing in a full planning or last planner is the communication, is having the stakeholders and subcontractors to meet periodically and being able to participate into analyzing the plan and revising it. So briefly, each party have a set of sticky notes, color-coded sticky notes, and then we would have a whiteboard, and on this whiteboard, from the CPM schedule, from the ASTA or the P6 schedule, we would extract the completion dates for the next period from the schedule. It's very important, and apply these dates as a constraint. Okay, guys, that's the next plan, next period plan, and we want to meet these dates. So put it on a whiteboard as a milestones, and then each subcontractor has to write down each daily task on their sticky notes. Identify the tasks, how many resources or how many labor will be working on it, if possible, the amount of time it will take, and each sticky note should reflect a task. Afterwards, each subcontractor should start going backwards from the milestone, sticking up the notes in sequence according to his performance, moving backwards until the current data date. And while doing so, they try to put the sticky notes in sequence according to their performance and according to other subcontractors' performance. So if I know that there is other subcontractor that has to perform X before I perform Y, I would put my sticky note before his sticky note or his tasks. After they do such, we would have something as similar to this, just like a bunch of sticky notes, color coded. I know the subcontractor, that's the ceiling subcontractor, that's the tiles, that's whatever. And they are somehow in sequence according to each other, meeting the overall milestones extracted from the CPM. The following step is either the project manager or the scheduler on a separate board start sorting these tasks out by days. So taking all these sticky notes and start sorting them by day. So I would know that on this day, this subcontractor should be doing this task. On the following day, the following subcontractor should be doing these tasks. After putting it day by day, the overall logic for these notes should be compared to the original logic that they put together on the first board. After doing this, I would have a breakdown for a day-by-day scope for each subcontractor based on their input, based on their breakdown, knowing how long it will take, knowing the resources if possible, and knowing how it interacts with other subcontractors to meet the completion dates in the schedule. And by the completion dates in the schedule, I don't mean the critical completion dates, I mean all completion dates that I want to meet within my next period, regardless its criticality. I might highlight this is more critical or this is a higher priority, but in general, it should be applied to all the activities within the next period, periodic update. Okay, after setting this out, what if it doesn't, what if the milestones are not achievable? Like we've done all of this, we've put it all together, but still with these tasks and durations, these milestones are not achievable. Then a discussion has to be pulled out. And guys, this is not achievable. We have to identify the reasons. Why? Is there any subcontractor here that should bump up his resources? Like, is it depending on one subcontractor that he should include the resources? The factors behind the plan not being achieved should be identified in this meeting after doing this exercise. And whatever should be applied to rectify this should be discussed. Okay, this subcontractor, can you increase your resources? Is it a sequence issue? What is it? Afterwards, if it wasn't a resource issue, if it wasn't an availability issue, if it wasn't a duration issue, it's just that this sequence is not applicable. Like something doesn't feel right. The durations, you try to cut it down as much as possible. That's as low as it can get, and still the milestones are not achievable. If this is the case, then that's a red flag that the plan needs a revision. These durations are not applicable, and that means that I would have to revise my CPM schedule. So you set the day-by-day tasks, you define it, you put the sequence, and then are the milestones achievable or not? If not, great. That's the plan, and that's what we'll be doing the next update. If not, okay, it's not achievable. Why? 1, 2, 3, 4. Try to work it out with the subcontractors to still meet the plan. We still need to meet these dates. If you as a PM or scheduler found out that you've pushed the subcontractor, you've done everything possible to meet these milestones and it's still not achievable, then the CPM schedule has to be revised to accommodate for this variance. Last but not least, in this meeting, I've mentioned what to be done generally in this meeting. What about the following meeting? So you've done this, you've set the plan for the periodic update, and you've gone through the month, and you're doing your next update. You've analyzed the schedule, you've identified the variances, and what activities has been delayed. You identified the responsible party for these variances, and now you're having the meeting. First, these variances has to be discussed before anything. Before you run this exercise again for the next periodic update, first, guys, these activities has been delayed. Activity 1, you're responsible for it, why it has been delayed. And you have to go through in details, why, what kind of resources should you have assigned to it versus what actually happened. He has to have a proper justification for each of these variances and delays. Each party responsible for any delay has to justify that. This stuff has to be documented. documentation for these meetings are very important. Why? Because on the following meeting, if the same issue arises from the same subcontractor and documented, on the third meeting, an action has to be taken. This subcontractor is not performing. So I wouldn't be able to do this unless I document the variances, I discuss it, we agree on a plan to rectify it, and see how we perform against the plan that we agreed on. If he didn't perform, the following meeting, I would highlight it again. The third meeting, an action should be taken to, against the subcontractor, either, however, many stuff that could be, either I can bring another subcontractor, find a way to increase the resources and meet the overall milestones. After we set the plan on the previous board we mentioned, we used these tasks and boards to come up with our control schedules, which is 2, 3, 6 weeks look at. And simply, it's a reflection for what's been agreed on in the pool planning meeting or the last plan. So, as I mentioned, in the pool planning, these tasks are based on the milestones extracted from the CPM. So, the 3 weeks look at generally should include the following layout. First is the CPM activity or the monthly schedule activity with the ID. Second are the tasks extracted from the pool planning meeting that we had. Each task has its own responsible party according to the color code we have and has its own dates based on the way they laid it out. It should be reflected on a simple Excel chart, and this will be my control schedule. So I will use this pool planning to first identify responsible parties and variances and document it to see whether they are performing or not. Once we agree on everything, I extract my 2-3 weeks look ahead based on this and distribute it out for each subcontractor to know what he should be doing on each day. And then me as a PM or superintendent should be monitoring their performance on a daily basis to make sure the overall plan is being achieved. Okay, what if I have a delay and we identified the delay, we identified all the responsible parties, and I found out that an action needs to be taken. And by action, I mean recovery. For example, what should I do or how would I approach it? Recovery in general is part of what we call scheduled compression. So after the meeting, I found out that I've been delayed. It's my delay as a contractor and I need to recover. Generally, the scheduled compression recovery is one of the scheduled compression applications. Another application is, and it will have the same methodology. Simply you have a duration that, or you're finishing behind time and you want to finish early. So you apply scheduled compression whenever you want to recover your delay, or whenever you're directed by the client. So the client decided that some stuff happened and I need this project finishing 2 months ahead. That's another case for scheduled compression that will follow the same methodology for applying that scheduled recovery. Third, if you have a financial incentive tied to your completion date and you need to finish ahead of time as much as possible to achieve these incentives, again, compression will be applicable. Last, if you have another project, for example, that you need to start as a company, as a corporate, and you need to get done with this project, regardless how much it would cost you, because that's a better opportunity or that's a big opportunity that you don't want to miss out, again, scheduled compression will be applicable. Scheduled compression in general has 2 methods. There are only 2 ways known that to compress a schedule or to recover a schedule. And these are the fast tracking method and crashing. What's the overall differences? The fast tracking is simply, it's a fancy word for resequencing. I'll go through the paths, the relationships between activities and the relationships between entire paths and see what can be done, what activities can go in parallel instead of in sequence. And start applying these resequences to mitigate as much time as possible. That's the general definition of fast tracking. Crashing is simply crashing the durations. I don't go through the logic. I don't go through anything. I just take the longest path and I'll try to crash as much durations on it as possible. So fast tracking is resequencing, for example, activity tied with the finish to start. I'll find a way to do it in parallel and change it to start, finish to finish, and thus mitigating some time. Fast tracking usually costs much less than crashing, but it has a very high risk for lower quality because you're doing a lot of stuff at the same time. You're crashing your resources, doing different activities. Usually, have a higher risk. So it's a lower cost, but a higher risk for quality. One very important thing is that for schedule compression in general, fast tracking has to be, you have to attempt to fast track first before you would apply crashing. So the first step is to, okay, let's go through the logic and try to revise it as possible to mitigate the delay. Why is that? Simply because it costs much less than the crashing. Crashing in general, as I mentioned, is cutting duration. How would you do this? It's resources. Okay, first I'll try to work on the weekends. Second, I'll try to work overtimes. Third, I'll try to add a night shift. Fourth, I would change my equipment. If I have a specific equipment, I can bring another more advanced equipment that have a higher production so that it takes much less durations. There are various measures or methods to apply crashing methods into the schedule compression, but usually it's related to adding up resources or overtime, weekends, and shifts. And one last thing, crashing always comes with added costs. So always attempt to fast track first and then apply crashing. And that's it for the schedule maintenance. Any questions?
The rule of thumb that I've been told is that if you know that you're going, like you had a finish to start relationship and you're basically in the field created a start relationship. You said that this activity couldn't do it so until this is done. And you find you're in the progress view and you find that. Do you change the logic before you progress the activity, or can, like with the logic changes, like you have to change the logic to match what you're doing. You don't override logic with progress. I found that if you do the progress and then back change the logic, if you will, to reflect what you did, it ASTA specifically has a bunch of errors.
Have you applied the two things?
I just checked. To be honest with you, I had no idea those boxes existed. Matt, did you know that? No. Yeah, I did not. My boxes were checked.
Yeah, so when it checked, there is something called a progress override in P6. It does the same thing. It just cut the activity and push it after the predecessor. Basically, it overrules the existing relationship over the progress. It does not reflect reality on site. If you uncheck them, it will show as an out of sequence that has to be resolved to maintain the original, to obtain the correct logic, basically.
What would happen is we would progress an activity, and then I could never figure out why the start date of the successor activity would not line up to what logic on the paper said. Because those boxes are checked. Yep.
Uncheck them and uncheck them and solve the out of sequence. It will resolve it. Okay.
And recheck them?
No. Just leave them unchecked because as long as they are checked, they wouldn't show the software wouldn't capture the out of sequence.
It's like a lot of times we do that a lot where our original plan is finish to start, and then in the fast tracking situation, we're like, no, you guys got to get started. And it's a lot of effort for the scheduler, whoever's doing the physical updating, to go try to change everything before you update so the logic is right. And it's a lot of work.
Yeah.
So you can basically
update it. It will highlight the out of sequences, go in there, filter them, and solve the out of sequence, and that's it.
If I filter the out of sequence and change the logic to match what I've done, then the dates will then be
yes.
correct.
Yes.
That's amazing.
The dates will correct themselves. Okay.
I'm crying and
So that's for the update. We'll go through the overall change management, how to address any changes that happen on the site, and then hopefully, if we have enough time, we'll go through the schedule analysis. For the change management, Dan Moses will be demonstrating that with you. Click on the mouse down forward.
Yeah. All right. So, change management generally, this could be its own 3-hour presentation. So, what we're not doing is getting into all of the means for defending entitlement for various types of changes. What we do want to do is just highlight some of the best practices for making sure that we're capturing the right documents contemporaneously so that when we do go to submit a change request to the client, we're not going back and trying to scramble for information. So I'm going to talk generally change management, and then I'm going to talk through how that process flows into the scheduling application. So change management very necessarily begins with knowing your contract, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But that's always your starting point. Is you can't really identify a change if you don't know what your contractual obligations are. So start off with understanding what our contract is. We want to make sure that we're identifying issues proactively. We don't want to make sure that we wait until things are, at kind of critical mass before we start, doing any legwork. We want to do that as soon as we're alerted to the fact that something could be an issue and get the process started. That process starts by creating an issue folder and populating it with the appropriate correspondence. With each change and with each contract, there's notification that's going to be required to be provided to the owner in order to preserve our rights to inequitable adjustment. So we want to just review a couple of examples of the notification requirements in your contracts. Bring that to everybody's attention, and then when we're ready and we're at a point where we can submit that information, we'll package it up and get that submitted. On the federal side, we normally call that a request for equitable adjustment, probably generally referred to as a change order or a change request on the commercial side. But where you see a request for equitable adjustment, that's not a familiar term. It just means a request for a contract modification or a change order. So know your contract. Seems like a pretty obvious statement, but it can be something that really gets us in trouble if we're not crystal clear as to what the contract is. So at a very basic level, it's know what's in your drawings, know what's in your specifications, but more appropriately, it's knowing what portions of that contract you as White's has retained, and what is retained by the owner, what's retained by the subcontractors, and making sure that we don't overstep our bounds in solving problems that don't belong to us or would be better dealt with by the contract parties that actually own that risk. By a show of hands, how many of you have an engineering background, either by education or experience? Okay, and how many have a construction management type of a degree or a background? All right, so in my experience, what engineers and construction professionals are really good at is solving problems, right? That's just how we think. We see an issue and we want to try to find a solution to it. And that's really good for 90% of what we do. It helps us progress through the project. But one area where that gets us into trouble is where the ownership of a particular problem really belongs with the owner or really belongs with the subcontractor. And because we're so inclined towards providing solutions, we overstep our bounds and we start providing solutions on behalf of the owner to the subcontractor, or providing direction to a subcontractor that really should flow through the owner to us and then to the subcontractor. So we need to be aware of really what our scope is, what the owner's responsibilities are, what the subcontractor's responsibilities are, and make sure that if we start to see deviations from the administration of the responsibilities of the parties, that triggers a red flag in our mind, and we begin the process of documenting these issues. So issues generally, we want to consider anything that has the potential to impact the project cost or the project time, right? That's just a simple definition of what we want to consider to be an issue. When we see that, we want to begin documenting it immediately. We're going to have a lot of issues that ultimately we don't pursue as changers, or that they don't really materially impact the project schedule. But it's better to have a log with more issues that ultimately we close without having to pursue a change for, than it is to not have a proper record and then have to go back and scramble for documentation. So the first thing that we want to do is just create an issue number in a register that we start assigning to each type of correspondence that deals with that particular issue. All right. we want to do it right away. We don't want to wait until it becomes critical and go back and scramble. We want to create a folder and populate it with like type correspondence. And we want to fill out an issue summary form. So I've got one of those on the next slide, just as an example. I can send you this, or you can recreate it pretty quickly on Excel. But basically what we're doing here is within this issue folder is we've got a file that just says contract number, name, location, and just gives you a quick overview of what that particular issue is. This is good for you as project managers, and it's also good for your project executives or anybody else that's going to come in and get involved with the resolution of a particular issue. They can go here, and in a matter of a couple minutes, they can look at the summary, and then behind the summary and within that folder, they're going to have all the correspondence that correlates to that issue. And so now we're not going back to emails. Now we're not trying to remember which RFI it was that we sent. We've got the issue summary here. We've got a quick description of what the issue is and how it's progressing. And then we can go to the issue folder and actually look at what's in there. So we've got our impact summary form. Any letters or emails, submittals, RFI, meeting minutes, you guys get the idea, that relates to that issue in any way, you get it in there, you tie it to that issue number, and the data is already there. You've begun creating your chronology for a future document. And Adam can tell you about that. He had the opportunity to go through 1420 Oak and pull up a whole bunch of old correspondence to help us present a claim to the owner. It takes time if it's not there contemporaneously. So you have that in there. You want to put your cost analysis in there. So as you're getting to the point where you're ready to submit something to the client, you've got your cost analysis. Again, that's right there in the folder. The next portion of this segment will deal with the schedule maintenance portion, ultimately feeding into what might be a schedule analysis later on. That's in there. Now you're ready to go. So you've got all of this information. It's there, and you're not going back and scrambling to find it.
One comment, because a lot of our RFIs, we have schedule impact and cost impact. So we should be doing one of these for pretty much all our RFIs. That's going to be.
You got to use your judgment, right? So what we're trying to call as an issue is if it has the potential to impact the project schedule or the project cost. So if it's a really trivial thing that's probably not going to manifest into a change request, use your judgment. But if it has the characteristics of something that can snowball over time, what you don't want is, you got 300 RFIs or whatever you have on the project, and go back and try to remember which one it is because you didn't take it and segregate it when you could, and just tag it in that folder. So to do it in real time takes no time at all, really.
Well, I'm just looking from, and don't take this wrong, Adam, one of our two problem child is Oak. So Oak would have been a prime example where we probably should have done more of these. Right? I'm just, just talking out loud.
Yeah. So, I mean, from a practical project management standpoint, you think, all right, am I going to create 400 issues over the life of this project when really only 5 or 6 issues are going to be material later on? That's probably too much detail. But you also don't want to just have the most critical 6 or 7 issues. And the fact of the matter is, a lot of times you don't know at the inception of the impact that it's going to be critical. And so this is really more due diligence at the outset. I'm going to take a little bit of extra time now to save myself a whole lot of time later on. So it's, is there an exact science to it? No. But is there, kind of a common sense application to it? I think there is. So you use your judgment when something comes up.
We always just said if there was any doubt whatsoever.
Well, I mean, maybe look at the owner. I mean, is he flying me or not? So, if he's flying me, we started building our kid out of the box. Right?
Yeah, I mean, we just said when in doubt, always err on the side of caution, cost risk.
What, fly me?
Does that answer your question? Yeah. All right. Anybody else have anything? Can I go backwards?
Yeah.
All right, what am I doing here?
So you're going right.
All right, we're getting somewhere now.
All right, hang on. Totally screwed myself up here. We do this, we did this. We did not do
I
this.
think you're on page 70.
No, you're right.
I'd say you're on page 70.
77.
All
right. So, like I mentioned before, Shad put together a project folder with some of your owner contracts in there. So you guys are aware that you have to provide notification, but I put it up here in the slide just to pull from your specific projects that you've got out here, what some of those requirements are. Generally speaking, with regard to notification, most contracts require that before you incur costs associated with a particular issue that you intend to present as a cost to the owner, you have to provide them notification. Really, you have to provide them an opportunity to mitigate the impact. You have to provide them an opportunity to tell you not to proceed with a particular change. So we need to make sure that whatever the particular requirements on your contract are, that you're very familiar with those as project managers and superintendents, and that you don't proceed with changed work until you have assurance that you'll be paid for that change work. And one of the biggest problems that we've seen on our side, and that's fairly common, is to proceed with the change with the understanding that you're going to get taken care of. And then when the reality of the cost of that change work comes in and gets presented to the owner, they think, well, this is not really what we meant. And now you've got a dispute type of a situation on your hands because you didn't take the steps up front to give them a rough order of magnitude for the cost, to notify them that you're proceeding pursuant to the conversation or pursuant to their change request. And now you've got a tricky situation where maybe you've sunk costs into the change and you're going to have to scramble to actually try to recover those costs in the form of a modification. One comment on here, don't worry too much about the source, that's a little bit beyond this, but ultimately all contracts will, carry with them a duty to mitigate. And so when we do find ourselves in a situation where we have a change, it's clearly an owner change and we're due compensation for it, it's not an opportunity for us to pile on costs to jack up fee. It's something that an owner will commonly come back with and say, you had a duty to mitigate this delay. And we need to demonstrate in real time that we were making decisions that were in the interest of the client that helped alleviate the extent of what otherwise could have been a more costly change. So just be aware of that. So at this point, we've done the legwork. We've got our issue folder, and we've got all the correspondence. Now we're ready to pull a letter together. Use that correspondence as an exhibit to demonstrate that, the history of the issue that we're discussing is supported by factual data. It's not anecdotal. We're not saying, oh, well, this was a really hard project and you guys kind of know that this was messy, so you got to work with us. No, we've got all the information that supports this change, the discussions that we've had about it, and now we're ready to package that up and get something submitted to the client. All right, so that's, again, just a very quick overview of change management generally. How does that apply to this discussion pertinent to scheduling today? We're here to talk about scheduling, not change management. So scheduling and your schedule analysis is perhaps the most critical component of any submission that you have that has to do with any sort of delay to the project. Owners want to see that you're not just making up some amount of time. They want to see that you've done an analysis, that the facts support your analysis, and that they owe you time pursuant to the terms of the contract. And so we need to make sure that as we're going through, just like keeping an issue file, we want to make sure that we're tracking issues in the schedule updates as they progress. So as Mohammed's talked about in depth previously, the regular meetings with all the project stakeholders is a key component of making sure that the data that we're recording is accurate and it will stand up to scrutiny. If later on people want to try to attack the veracity of the data, we have good files supported by contemporaneous documentation that we can present. So we want to identify new impacts through the update cycle process. We want a status prior impacts with the current status, whether they've just progressed or if they've concluded and now we can move forward. We want to evaluate those and we want to submit our REA. So going back to Dowie's prior slide, this is where that falls in the update sequence cycle. So it's a part of that review scope and changes process. So this is a snippet from Contract Watts scheduling protocol. It's just a pretty simple kind of logic path that just says, you know, how do you think through this? Well, when you're meeting on site with your owners, you're meeting with your subcontractors, you say, okay, ask the question, has an impact arisen since the prior meeting? Has one concluded? And what do we need to do with that information? If one has begun, let's get the correspondence associated with that and start building out our fragnet. If one has concluded, you know, is it time to put that together in a package and get that submitted? Okay. So I'll show you on the next couple of slides what this actually can look like in a project schedule, but within the schedule file itself, you want to create the new activities associated with each major impact. Again, this is a judgment call. You know, am I going to put, you know, every RFI as a new activity in my schedule? No. But am I going to put key indicators of, you know, what's happened over the life of a project in there? Yeah. Or over the life of an impact in there? Yeah. So you got to use your best judgment on that. So this is an impact fragment that we had from one of our projects, I believe in Hawaii. So the highlighted bars show kind of the critical activities within that fragment. Basically, we find a differing site condition out on site. That goes in there as an activity, right? That's a pretty obvious one. We found something that's going to need to be dealt with. We want to start tracking that. So we create an activity, then we put it in the schedule. We provide notice to the client, right? We want to have that date recorded because, of course, they're going to push back and say, well, when did you give us notice? And did we have time to work with you? We had an important conference to talk through that. There was a waiting period while we're waiting for the government, our owner in this case, to provide, you know, additional direction for us to work through. Eventually we worked through a proposal submission and a modification process. And so as you're marching through, you know, this one in particular spanned a very long period of time. So if I wait until I'm down here at the modification to insert a new activity in my schedule, well, I've missed many months of really important schedule history. And so we don't want to wait until that modification. It doesn't, again, it's one of these low effort, potentially high return types of efforts is to just include the pertinent information as you do your updates so that you can continue to track it. One of my notes coming up, so this is just more of the same, it just follows the chain of that activity through. Yeah, it's a lot, right? So imagine going backwards at the end of this and trying to justify to the owner how much back and forth there was throughout this entire, that's a much more challenging task than it is to add an activity to their update. So that's why I use such a big one, just to paint a clear picture that this can be a hugely cumbersome project.
That was going on for a long time.
Oh yeah, still going on. So.
Can you go back and couple slides?
Yeah, sure can. I think. Yeah. Where'd you like me to go?
Right there. So you've got a project impacts.
Yeah, so this is.
Basically that every impact falls under that section.
Yeah.
Rather than having activities just scattered throughout your schedule, kind of
Yes.
to where they impact other activities
Yeah.
already.
Well, it's just the way it's coded so that it could be
Well,
looked at.
that's its own work breakdown structure, and now you're going to start pushing me beyond my
I would add to that,
schedule. No.
any changes, so we would have like the WS for modification. I would have one WS for modification 1 that has activities related to modification 1, modification 2, and so on. Impact, same thing, with WS for impact 1, 2, 3. Any activity related to this impact gets added under this WS. So it's very easy to track and figure out
And then you tie that, like impact two, right?
Design to the scope.
You tie that back to the scope
Right.
and if the last item there that says, I don't know, at that point, we resolved it, we're back to drilling.
And once you add it in your WS, tie it to the active scope, that's stuff.
Right, so it would be in between two tracker files.
Exactly. So it's very easily to be traced back and identified and presented to the client.
I think this is really, really important. This is a large basis for this training. I think a lot of times issues happen and they're affecting things. And if you don't add this, then your original activity is just extending out and there's no record of why or how it's extending
Right.
out. Right? So you can't go back and make this clear. Adding this detail, breaking that activity, and this was finished, but this was stopped. Those kind of things is what we
Right.
need to do better. job.
So one additional thing, so we've got two impacts that are shown here, really on that schedule, I don't know, 10 or 20, there are a lot of impacts, right? And so as you can imagine, these impacts, they don't all start one after the other, right? There's different impacts that are going on at different times, and that can make it incredibly difficult to present, particularly if there are different owners of impact 1 and impact 2 and impact 3, right? So later in the presentation, if we get to it, I go through some of the high-level time impact analysis protocol. But what you would see with the time impact analysis is that when we're analyzing impact 2, you've created the entire fragment and you have the logical successors that are tied to this fragment. And so it makes the actual presentation of the time impact analysis really fluid. But if you have to go back and recreate this, it can take months because now you're going back and you particularly if you're in a claim type of a situation that has the potential to go to litigation, and you're going to have a scheduling expert on your side, you can have a scheduling expert on the other side that really wants to rip apart every bit of information that you present as factual. And that's why having these issue folders and tying and creating these activities that correlate with the documentation that you have is so important. The fact of the matter is you mentioned that, okay, there are maybe 2 problem projects, right? When really, maybe 10 or 15 are going great. The fact of the matter is that 2 problem projects can erase the profitability of those other ones that are doing great. Because when projects really go negative, they go way negative, or they can, right? And so if you're making your 5 to 10% or whatever it is on your jobs all over the place, if you lose 40% on a big one, you've just, you've heard a lot of other projects, right? So that's why this stuff is important. It can feel as a project manager when you've got all of these other things that you have to do just to get across the finish line. Like really, you're going to come in here and add work to us, when my project's going just fine and I don't need this. You don't need it until you need it. And when you need it, you really need it. So it's just it's a best management practice. And as you make it a part of your day-to-day, you don't even think about it. This has come up, create the issue file, create the issue folder, get it in there, and you have the information when you need it.
The examples you have of your obvious impacts, those other things that are less obvious.
Yeah.
You mentioned modifications, so that's in thinking change documents that the design teams issue, whether it's design-driven or owner-driven changes, that can fall into a separate fragment. Document changes.
We use that term differently, but yeah.
Yeah. And then you have the subcontractor issue. So if you have sub delays, does that go in its own fragment as well, or is that
sub delays?
Impact, or how do we?
Yeah, that's a good question. Subcontractor delays on a prime contract schedule can be a little bit more challenging to reflect because the fact is that the subcontractor's activities are your activities as far as the owner is concerned, right? So really, oftentimes, subcontractor impacts will manifest in the schedule as activity durations that have gone greater than planned. You can and probably should still include your own impacts within this, right? That lends to your integrity as a builder, showing that, okay, I'm not just putting in owner impacts here and putting in our impacts, they're going to tie to the activities that they tie to. If there's a subcontractor impact that is not inherent within the activities assigned to that subcontractor, and we can create new impact activities to reflect that, that would be one pretty easy way to take that. In the similar fashion, you would take that fragnet, it would tie to both subcontractor activities, and it would include these additional impact activities, and you can say, when you run that schedule, how much has that delayed the project? And that, instead of being presented to the owner, you send that to the subcontractor as the basis for your batch charge.
Let me give you an example. So Troy and Troy's job right now, there's problems with the drywall finishing. Troy, you can chime in here.
Great.
So they've gone in, finishing quality has been subpar. We've done prime painting that's exposed some of those deficiencies. Finishing's had to come back. We've had to redo painting. Some of the other work's progressed. Cabinets have come in, trim, doors, and this back and forth of additional finishing rework and painting rework continues to kind of happen with some of the other work progressing. But in the end, our punch process can't move forward because of these deficiencies.
So that's a great example, right? So you've got your original fragment that was planned, and that represents how the work was supposed to progress. That's where you start, right? That's going to be what your basis of comparison is. This is at the point in the project where, before we started having these drywall issues, this is where we were projecting to finish. Now I have that planned work, and I introduce it because I've been maintaining the schedule. If there's a rework or a remobilization for the drywall, or to come back and repair the deficient drywall, I add that in as a new activity, and I tie it logically wherever it goes. Okay. After I've built that out and after we've resolved the issue, I go back to the schedule in effect at the inception of the delay, meaning the schedule that existed before we started having these issues. I take that as-built fragment, I insert it into that schedule, and I run it. I compare the new finish date to what it was before it was impacted, and now I know the extent of the effect of that particular issue, because that subcontractor required remobilization, required new activities, and I have a clean start, which is the point before we had to start correcting their work, or they had to correct their own work, and I have the resultant schedule after including the rework activities. All right, that's a very clean way of doing it. If we don't do this proactively, if we wait until there's 10 or 15 issues that everybody's pointing fingers at each other, that's where you start to have overlaps of impacts, and you have to follow a fairly technical procedure to determine that whether or not there's actual concurrency or things are just happening in parallel, and evaluate the relative ownership. So it gets a little bit more complicated, but that's a kind of a simplified way of.
I'm sure you said we're not that clean, but that's the purpose of having this discussion. So we can understand it, get better at managing it, to protect ourselves, and hold the subs accountable and all that. So it's something that you guys can dive into more tomorrow. And
and it's easy. One thing that's easy for me to say, it's a little harder to do, but that I would still encourage you very much to do, is as these are occurring, either as soon as the fragment has completed and you're moving on, or if possible sooner, when you have a realistic forecast for when that impact is going to complete, package that up and get it submitted. What happens is, in the fog of war, so to speak, when we're so busy doing all these other things, these types of issues get backburned. And it seems like, the focus is always get the job done. We make money by getting the job done and getting off and getting on to the next one. That's true. But we miss opportunity to negotiate and settle claims by waiting until it's comfortable and convenient for us to get something submitted. So it's really important, as much as you can, to make settlement of these issues a priority, so that you're not subjecting yourself to the possibility that this clear issue that I could have settled based on clean facts is now convoluted by the reality of a complex construction project that's had impacts from all these different project players. So, that makes sense?
Yeah. Well, you should be adding this information contemporaneously to your schedule updates. I mean, this is 9 months that we have just on this one page here for impact number 2. Now, I can tell you on any job, if you're going to have a 9-month impact, it's going to have an effect on the critical path.
I mean, on most of our impacts, probably 90% of them are subcontractors not performing. So that's, to Chad's point, like that's as the general contractor, we lose our ass because we cannot accurately point to you delayed us, the LDs and costs of extended GCs and whatever that are the result of your delay or your costs. And that's where the fingers, like, we're pretty good at document learning in general.
Yeah.
Like that whole impact, I mean, we're better at it than
And
some of
what
us.
makes it even harder is when, the cumulative effect of 900 RFIs or something.
Yeah.
Each one individually, it's hard to point to, yep, here's a point in the critical path that this RFI delayed us. The cumulative effect, and I don't know if there's a piece of that, but I don't think we do much of incorporating fragments into our schedule or RFIs, change documents, and things like that. We'll get the job done, we'll absorb it, we'll just make it all happen. And it's not always happening, so I think it's just as relevant.
And I think part of that goes back to the point that you made at the very beginning here, where, and that's how we're wired, right? We're problem solvers.
Yeah, right.
We want to fix the problem and move on with life. Not, it might be a day here, a day there, but over time, a day here, a day there.
Yeah.
And the real issue is the liability down the road.
It's a pretty fundamental difference. I mean, the government won't allow you to do the work. They won't just file a compensate you like it's a stop or a private side. It's anything but that.
Yeah.
Later.
Well,
it's difficult to like change the.
yeah, you've got different interests at play on the commercial side than you do on the government side. Basically, as long as on the government side you strictly meet the contract, they can't preclude you from bidding the next job. The owner doesn't like you, he's not going to invite you to bid the next job on the commercial side. So you've got different realities at play, and you need to, obviously you guys are aware of, on our side, we want to keep the client interest, but ultimately we want to protect the downside risk. You guys have to balance that as well. Speaking to the subcontractor issue, what makes evaluating subcontractor issues a little bit more challenging than neatly inserting a fragment in there is that a lot of times you will have inefficiencies within a subcontractor's sequence of work that don't really delay the project, but they do create, instead of things running in sequence, now you've got clusters of work that has to occur simultaneously instead of and so what you're really talking about there instead of delay is disruption. And quantifying disruption is a very challenging thing to do, but it should still be tracked.
It forces trade stuff.
Yes, exactly.
So then there's always cost for the next trade coming down the line.
Right.
It says, wait a minute, the schedule should be doing this.
Yeah.
And now I'm doing that much VCT, the dipshit's still over here on the left.
Right.
I think that we lose a ton of money, company, license, in that piece, right? We absorb a lot of that.
That also comes back to
We take
relations.
those hits if they come in on Saturday, we'll
Right.
pay the half time. We take a lot of hits to smooth things out, just to keep things going the way they go.
Yeah.
Because one guy's not quite done, one company's not quite finished. Trying to figure out how to manage that, and pick up, I can't fathom the amount of money to pick up on one job. What we spend to smooth out that problem.
Yeah. And I don't know if you've got, that kind of a risk contingency built into your project. And so there's a certain amount of that's
There's some
anticipated.
of that.
Yeah. But if you don't spend that risk contingency, that goes to profit, right? So just the thought there is that, we're a pretty sophisticated general contractor, right? And if, we go to the owner and they really make us prove it, what we're learning is that, we have to do a little bit of scrambling in order to actually prove that a delay caused us to incur added costs, right? Most of the subcontractors that I've ever worked with would have an even harder time trying to establish that. And so you should never take advantage of them, but you should also be willing to make them prove that you actually caused them to incur added costs. Maybe they couldn't do as much VCP as they expected to, from the original plan. How did that really cost them? How do they really, can they come back to you and prove, not just speculate, not just
Eventually, it
anecdotal?
hits the schedule,
Right.
Eventually, those small pieces, day by day by day,
Yes.
will have an impact that says, no, I actually have to finish this VCT in this room on this day to do what I need to do.
Right.
They're gonna be the last guy through, whatever, it's the painter, I don't care who it is.
Yeah.
Right, you always hear the joke, the painter is one guy at the end of the meeting, and they work all the hours, all the time, lost all the way to it. Eventually, you hit that, you can't trace that without running into that problem.
Yeah. And I think this is where Dowie's analysis section really adds a lot of value coming up, is understanding that how you're setting your schedule up such that you're making sure that you're minimizing the prospective trade stacking due to a series of minor slips. You distribute that such that you try to get some of that front loaded, and then if you do have those slips, you can absorb it a little bit later on, instead of having a whole bunch of series of activities that have a huge amount of float, so you don't start them as early as you ought to, and set yourself up for that type of situation. All right, where are we? Generally, when you're entering these impact activities, you want to maintain those to the left of the day-to-day. That is for particularly true of prospective changes that you're talking about with the client. One of the problems that we have seen come up a number of times is you start talking to the client about a potential change that they would like to see, and we go ahead and we stick the entire fragment in the schedule. And then they come to realize how much it's going to cost, and they say, you know what, we're actually not going to move forward with that. So, that comes 3 months later, and you say, okay, well, I've been carrying this logic in my schedule, pushing activities, erroneously for a number of months. And really all I've done is just created a bad record of what's going on. So we want to keep the impacts generally to the left of the day-to-day. If there are certain inevitabilities, if I've hit a differing site condition and I necessarily have to do a certain sequence of work, and that sequence of work is to the right of the day-to-day, okay, that's a realistic reflection of the impact that's going to happen. So you don't want to artificially suppress that logic and keep it to the left of the day-to-day, but you also don't want to incorporate information into the activity that you're not contractually bound to and that you may not be contractually bound to later on. So just keep that in mind. And the best practice, just like it's a good practice to, discuss your plan and discuss the actual as-built information with your subs and the owner. If there's an owner-related change and they have to provide a certain input in order for you to move forward, don't assume that on their behalf as to when that's going to happen. Ask them and get that information from them so that you're plugging their information in. And so when it doesn't come to fruition, you can say, well, we plugged it in based on the information that you gave us. We didn't assume something overly aggressive or underselling it and then have that backfire. So just a quick recap: be proactive, get your file started right away, use your best judgment as to when you do that. But think along the lines of, does this have the potential to increase my costs? Does this have the potential to delay my schedule? I want to start tracking that. Make it a part of your routine. Incorporate the impact activities into the schedule. And I really can't emphasize this last one enough. Get it submitted timely. Don't wait until it's too long, because it just crushes your ability to be successful in negotiations. All right. I thought that was supposed to be a ring.
It's after this.
It is.
How are you guys?
Yeah, how are you guys doing?
We're almost there. I would say we have 30 more minutes.
Keep rolling.
Trying to wrap it up.
We only have 2 hours left, right?
We can. One thing I'll say is we can stay, for us, obviously you guys have things to do after 5 or whenever you're going to be done. We can stay and answer questions or help out however we want. We're going to meet with you tomorrow as well for any specific questions. And That's probably it for me.
Okay. Schedule analysis. So, as I mentioned, when does the schedule analysis take place? Done the baseline, done the update. It goes before you meet with the stakeholders. It's a very important concept to have the schedule analyzed and to figure out the issues before you would meet with them, because this meeting is all about why this happened, who's responsible for it, what corrective action should or can you take. So you don't want to analyze it with them. You want to be not pointing fingers, but like, okay, your scope has been delayed by X amount of days. These are the activities, why, and what you're going to do about it. Generally, we analyze the schedule for three main reasons. First is to measure performance efficiency. How efficient are we compared to our plan? Second is to ensure the plan that we have so far is realistic, and that's we're progressing according to this plan. How realistic is it? That's one of the analysis aspects. And third is identifying risks and opportunities based on the variances and the analysis that I'll be going through. There are 4 documentations, online documentations out there that includes schedule analysis methodologies. The 2 most important of them is the DCMA 14 points. It's for both running quality checks on your schedule and applying schedule analysis. So the DCMA and the Passive Planning and Scheduling Excellence Guide, these documents are online, and it has a lot of information for quality check and analyzing schedule. I've summarized these documents into 7 main points for running a schedule analysis. First of which is scope validation for your next period. So regardless how much effort you put into breaking down your scope when developing the schedule, things might change when actually reaching the work. You might need to break it down further. You might need to, there are minute details that was not covered or was not included in your original scope. So just as a very good practice for each periodic update, the first analysis that should be applied is for the next period, is the scope correct? Does it cover what I have planned for my next period or not? Do I need to break it down further or not? Second is analyzing the flow paths. And the flow paths, by the flow paths, I mean the longest path first and the logical paths, which is the secondary paths or the near critical paths that we would, see in a minute. Third is activities progress analysis. How did the activities progress? Did it progress according to the plan? Did the activities start when they should have started, finished when they should have finished, and so on, so forth. 4 is the performance measurement indices. This is a very big, complicated subject. I've added a bunch of material in your slides. I wouldn't be going through all of it. I'll just be going through the summary, but I'll present how you can apply it and how beneficial it can be if applied correctly on the schedule to measure performance. 5 is, after measuring all these stuff, applying the variance analysis. So basically you're measuring float, dates, activities, and then you're comparing it with the previous to come up with the variance. And the variance is the difference between what should have happened versus what happened. 6 is using the variances to come up with trends, and we'll go through it in details. What is a trend, and how can I extract that from each monthly update? Last but not least, using the trends to identify risks and opportunities. So it all feeds into each other. The first, I would say, 4 steps are identifying stuff. The 5th step is comparing it to the previous. 6th step is comparing the variances to the previous variances to come up with a trend. Last step is using the trend to identify the risks and opportunities in a schedule. First is scope validation. As I mentioned, I wouldn't go much into it. Just filter the activities that you have for the next update, periodic update, and just go through it. Does it make sense? Do I need to break it down? Does it cover everything I know I should be doing within the next update period or not? If not, then you have to break it down further to the level of detail that you feel comfortable with to monitor and control your project. Second, after scope validation, longest path validation. That's, needless to say, it's very important for each update to extract your longest path and to go through these steps. First, the scope for the longest path. In the previous step, you've reviewed the scope for the next update period. The longest path can go way beyond that. You have to validate and review the scope for the entire longest path with each month, because it's very important. It defines your project completion. So you have to make sure all the activities are actually in appropriate detail, and it covers the scope that reflects what's going to happen in the longest path. Just validate the entire scope for the longest path month. Second, the durations on the longest path. Are these durations still valid? Is my previous performance or productivity rates would affect these durations? Do I need to revise it based on what I've done so far? And it goes both ways. Like if you overperform, do I need to cut it down and save time? If you underperform, do I need to increase it to match my overall production? Or I think I would be able to meet my planned production in these durations. Third is the logic. Same thing. Does the logic make sense for this path? Do I need to change anything on it or not? And then the last two is asking two simple questions. Does it make sense to be the longest path from construction perspective as a project manager? Is it logical for this path to be the longest path for my project? Like I would have a major building and like a lot of stuff, a complex construction, have a lot of systems in it, and the longest path is going through like a pavement and site utilities. It doesn't make sense. Something is wrong, either the duration for the utility is wrong, either something needs to be revised. It doesn't make sense. The building has to be the longest path. So this is a very important question. And last but not least, did it change from last update or not? If the longest paths keep changing between one update or another, there is a very significant something wrong with the schedule. It usually does not change except after a couple of updates when other paths start to progress. When it changes significantly between one update and another, it means two things. Either it's not realistic, and once you did an activity on it, or it goes out of sequence, so the logic is not correct. An activity over here started ahead of time, so you didn't have the correct logic. Or you have like 10 very near critical paths that keeps like shuffling between one update or another, which is it's a very high risk project if that's the case. So if it changes between one update and another, we have to know in details why did it change and how did it change, and will it change further on or not. That's for the launch path. The second flow path analysis is the near critical paths. This is as important as analyzing the longest path. What is a flow path? Simply, it's the second most critical path, and then the third most critical path. Fourth is the priorities, what I call your priorities in a project. You should focus your resources and everything according to the sequence of these paths. The longest path is the most important. You have to make sure you're meeting the dates and everything. But if you have a near critical path that has a total load of 5 days, 4 days, an adverse weather impact can make it the longest path in a simple update. So you would treat it as much or as important as the longest path. The third path, the fourth path, you have to review your flow paths on a monthly basis and see how it changed. How critical is it? Is it the second most critical path? Is it 20 days away from the longest path, or is it 1 or 2 days from the longest path? Okay, the flow path is defined priorities. As you can see here, I've tried to put it all together so you would see it's the second most critical path. How to extract the flow paths? This is a very important question, and that's a software-related question. So what I did is, again, I wouldn't go through the details. I've included how to extract the flow paths or the logical paths, as you call it in ASTA. How would you apply a layout, filter, and everything to extract the logical paths, which is it should be your priorities. Everything showing the column for the logical path, total quote, and then applying the specific filters to extract the overall report. Everything related to it until you reach this layout over here. So that's the longest path. This is the secondary path, third secondary, fourth secondary, and so on. So that it sort them out by the logical path, and that's your priorities in analysis.
So it's possible if those are that close to jump, like on our project, the elevators are right? Facades, and I'm just using bigger pieces. I mean, they're
2 days. Yeah.
touch.
It treat it as a longest
All of a
path.
sudden, the whole critical path changes on our project.
Treat it as a longest path. Extract this layout on a monthly basis and see how critical the second and third path are, and treat it as a longest path. I know if this path got delayed 2 days within a month, it will be a longest path. Then it is a longest path. Assign the proper resources for it, address it in a stakeholder review meeting, and make sure it's happening on time. That's why it's very important to extract the flow path analysis, or to apply the flow path analysis on a monthly basis.
Your updated percentage and your remaining duration can change for just one activity when you have two flow paths that are so close. That'll change the longest critical path.
Okay, and the overall steps in ASTA to extract this logical path is I've laid it down. One very important thing, the ASTA before the 14.0 did not have logical path. So if anyone had that older version, that 14.0, you wouldn't find this logical path. Anything afterward would include it.
What do we have?
I'm sorry?
A question on that. You know, we have.
It's like 14.69 or something.
Yeah.
I asked.
And
we're gonna get 14.
the newer ASTA is really cool. The schedule quality check in the newer ASTA is a really cool feature, and P6 doesn't have it, which makes me thinking of. But yeah, it is switching, yeah. So you will find it mostly in your ASTA, and really that's very important, either for prioritizing work or for assigning resources to mitigate a possible delay on a near critical path. Same thing for P6, how to extract it, all the filters, and that's how it looks. Flow path 1, 2, 3, and 4, and same thing. Okay, after you've analyzed your paths, the third step is to analyze the activities progression. What do you mean by activities progression? Asking these 4 questions. Which activity should have started and did not, and why? Which activity should have finished and did not, and why? Which activity that should have progressed in a certain way and did not meet that progress, and why? And which activity started or finished and shouldn't have started and finished. Basically, it happened out of sequence. So why this happened? These 4 questions has to be asked with each monthly updates and extracted from the schedule. How it gets extracted from the schedule? Simply by applying certain filters. Each of these questions, a filter can be created either in ASTA or P6 that can extract the activities, all the activities that should have started and did not, or should have finished and did not, and so on. And I can help you guys out putting these filters together. Needless to say, the whole schedule can be copied and pasted in Excel, and a simple tool can extract all of these stuff. So these should be extracted, categorized, and put on a log. And again, to get this in either P6 or ASTA, you have to have a schedule baseline assigned. As I mentioned, assign the previous updates so you'll be able to show the what should have started in the previous update and did not in the current. So it should have the 2 copies to extract these kind of information. You wouldn't be able to just extract it from the update after you do it. You have to have a reference to what should have happened versus what happened. Come up with these things. Again, you can extract it by certain filters. I can help you out with it, or it could be done in Excel. That's the activities progression. The performance measurement indices. Again, I've added a lot of material. I wouldn't go through it. I'll just go briefly. What are these indices? Generally, it's categorized into 2 categories. First is an earned value indices, or indices that gets measured according to performance, cost-based performance, I would say. The second are indices that's not related to the cost, and you guys don't cost load the schedule, so you can use the second category to measure the performance. These are stuff that measure specific features in a schedule that you can measure overall performance through. The first couple of slides go through the EVM. Again, it has to be coast loaded. What kind of indices there is, and the definition for each of them, and just it's a good material to have and to refer back to in case you decided to apply it.
So do you guys cost load with your stuff?
Yeah.
You do your subs work that way too?
We extract the billing percentage for the subs from our cost load schedule. But it's a federal requirement, so we cost load all our schedule. Okay, so for example, the SPI is the most known schedule performance index from the EVM method. It compares the value of work that was completed in a specific month versus what should have been completed. So it quantified the performance into a planned cost. So you should have done $2 million worth of work in February, and you only completed $1.5 million. So why is that? Where is the variance and why? Other indices that's not EVM related are the BEI, Baseline Execution Index, CEI, Current Execution Index, CPLI. CPLI is very important. It's the probability of achieving your critical path. How, a 1 year critical path that has 20 days of float. This is way more achievable than a 1 month of critical path that has 20 days of float. They have the 20 days of negative float. I mean. Both passes have the same number of total negative float, but which one is more achievable? The critical path that has a 1 year length of critical path that has 20 days of negative float, or a 1 month critical path that has 20 days of negative float. So this index over here defines the probability of achieving the critical path based on the length of the path, the critical path versus divided by the total float. TFSI, Total Float Consumption Index, how much you performed against your original plan. So 2 activities have negative 50 days of float, okay? 1 activity is has been ongoing for 2.5 years, and another activity has been ongoing for 6 months. Which of them is performing better? It's the same number of float. How would you comprehend which project is performing better when they're having the same number of float? This index tells you how. So the actual duration, how long it's been ongoing, versus how much float it lost within its actual duration. So an activity that's been ongoing for 6 months and lost 60 days, it lost 10 days each month. But an activity that's been ongoing for 1.5 years and lost 60 days is performing way much better than the previous one. So that's a very important index as well. These in general are the summary for the most important indices. The first one is the one related to the SI. The BI and the CI, basically it's the baseline execution index, which is the BAI. It measures how many planned activities has been completed according to the plan. So let's say in March update, we're planning to complete 20 activities in April. And in April, I found out that I completed only 10. So this index measures the total number of activities completed versus what was supposed to complete to show you how much you're performing or how good you're performing against your plan. CI measures the same thing, but the BI measures your performance against the original baseline. The CI measures your performance in a specific period of time, which could be a month or a week. How much of work you performed in a week compared to what you planned. That's just a figure for how, if these indices have been utilized properly, with a simple graph like this, simple chart like this, having these 5 indices, you can tell everything about a project without even opening up the schedule file or the longest path or any of the tasks. Simply, the BI is 0.6. It means that 60% of the activities should have been completed according to the original plan. Completed. SPI 9%. The value of these 60% represent 90%. I wouldn't go read through it and try to comprehend what it means, and if you'll actually be surprised of how much information you can tell based on just simple numbers extracted from the update and from a simple chart. And again, CPLI 0.5, that means I have a 50% probability to achieve my critical path, which is very low. A project that if my CPLI is last month was 0.5 and then 0.4, 0.3, something is wrong. If the number is going up, then project is overperforming or it's mitigating its delay, some stuff like that. But we throw these details. That's a simple example and see how much information you can extract. This could be on a project monthly report, or even an executive report to represent an overall progress in a simple number.
So does ASTA extract those numbers from doing that report?
No, there are. ASTA extract the earned value numbers, not the other ones. But these, I have an Excel tool where you would dump your schedule, copy it and paste it from ASTA or P6, and it will calculate these numbers in a nutshell. Okay, calculate these numbers and extract this chart. And I'm sorry.
Are all of the receivers kept cost loaded?
No, I mentioned that only the SPI. So I categorize them into the earned value indices, and these other indices, the DI, CI, CFCI, and CPLI does not need a cost loading. No, it's based on the number of activities. So how many activities should have been completed in the last month versus what was completed. The TXI, how much, what's the rate, or how many days you've lost within a specific period of time. That's how it measures the overall. The critical path, the length of the longest path, or the CPLI, the length of the critical path versus the total float lost. And again, read them these, and it will give you an indication for what it means.
Do we have projects that require reporting of those metrics?
No. I haven't seen any specs requires it. It's a very, it's getting into the industry, specifically the earned value management. It's getting into the industry big time. I've seen a lot of companies applying these indices like on a monthly basis, and reports includes the SPI, SPLI, and they measure their overall performance based on these indices. It's a more simple and accurate way to measure performance, rather than just like going through the flow path, negative flow and stuff, just like simple numbers. Variance analysis, variance. For everything we've measured so far, either the flow from the longest path, the activities progression, the number of activities that should have completed and not, and so on and so forth, and the performance measurement indices, we compared these to the previous month. What's the difference between them, and that's the variance. We extract this for all of these on a monthly basis, and then we would put it in a report that will go into our update documentation, as we'll present later on. The type of variance, either float or activity that should have started, activity should have completed, and the definition, what's the plan versus the what's the previous update number versus the current update, the variance, and then justification. This is very important to use into the stakeholder review meeting. So as you go through the previous steps, you extract the difference in the flow passes, the longest path, flow pass 1, 2, 3, 4. You're monitoring how the flow passes are changing throughout the updates. You're extracting the variance for these flow passes, or the number of activities that should have completed not, progress not, and the performance measurement indices, and you're highlighting the variances. In the schedule, in the stakeholder review, this is what you'll be discussing. Guys, these numbers, let's justify it, let's see who's responsible, and let's see how can we rectify it. Last in the analysis, not last, but the 2 steps. When the variances are done periodically, then you would have a variance report for each update. Putting these together in a simple chart would show you the trend. Meaning the SPI was 0.5 and changed to 0.4, 0.3, 0.2, 0.1, and so on. Putting it on simple charts like this, with a blink of an eye, you can see where you're heading. Where are your deficiencies at? From any of these indices, or the longest path total flow, it is going up, so I know I'm losing X number of days. Activity that should have started, completed, putting it all on a graph from the variances report give you a very good understanding on how good are you performing, where are the problem areas. And of course, reading out through these graphs, you'll be able to define easily what are the points of risks, which graphs are going down, and track these graphs back to the reason behind it, and see if for example, if the activities that's not completed each month, most of it is related to the same subcontractor. That's a trend you should take into consideration. That you should follow the trend back to its reason. Why it's performing this way, and if it's the justification or the reason identification throughout the updates would identify whether there is a risk that you should take an action against, or if you're performing well, that's an opportunity, and how we can enhance or maintain this performance. So basically, read through the graphs, and if it's going down, there's something wrong. Trace it back to the reason and try to fix it. If it's going up, then it's good. Still trace it back to the reason and try to maintain it or enhance it. 5 minutes, okay? 5 minutes. That's all I
I think
need.
you had a question.
Oh,
You say the running report, you say do it on a monthly basis then?
the what?
The reports, run them on a monthly basis?
Yeah. And
So then, how long should that job duration be? Is that like for a month, if the job is like 20 to 24 months, or, you know what I'm saying, if it's a shorter job, we should maybe run it.
if it's a shorter job, you'll have a more periodic update. I always refer to it as a periodic update because it depends on the job duration and the contract specs. A 1 year job would do an update every week, then run all these variances and trends is an Excel tool. You'll just like put the schedule, it will calculate all the indices and measure the variances, and then with another tool you can extract the trends. It doesn't take more than 10 minutes. So the effort isn't putting up the update itself. All of these are just like Excel stuff that gets extracted. And you know Power BI, that's a software, it does the same thing. Microsoft. Okay, documentation, we've done everything we need to put it all together and save it and archive it for many reasons. What are these reasons? First of all, is the conflict resolution. It's very important to have these stuff during any dispute, just to dig through it and know what happened when, and be able to present your case against either subcontractor or the client. It can be used for the as-built analysis for extracting productivities. If you overperformed in a project, you can get back to these documents and see the points where you overperformed, and with a good documentation, you'll be able to know the reasons why this project overperformed and start applying it on your projects. It helps not creating the trend analysis, but you can trace back your trends through the documentation. If you have a proper documentation and you have a trend and you decide and you want to trace it back to know the reasons, you go through the documents, the monthly documents or the periodic documents to identify these reasons. And then a capture or the changes in impacts gets documented on a periodic cycle. So you would know how the impact developed and how it progressed throughout the entire project cycle. In general, there are reports, and then there is a narrative report for documenting. I'll go through the reports briefly. These are the main columns that should be included in the reports when you print it. This is extracted from P6, but ASTA has the same exact columns. Long story short, for each periodic update, you should, at a minimum, have these reports. First, a report that includes all the activities with the bar chart showing it. Second is a report for the remaining activities. So one for the all activities, and second one for the remaining activities. So again, it's documenting and presenting the update. Third is the longest path. And again, I'm adding notes for how to apply these reports, and you can reach out back to me if you needed any assistance into developing these layouts or reports, because it's basically templates that you apply in either software. So the longest path has to be saved as well within each documentation for each periodic update. Flow paths, same thing, because as we mentioned, they act as critical as the longest paths. Logic report, how the activities were tied. This is very important for conflict resolution. You want to know how things were at a certain point of time and how they were linked. So extracting a logic report, again, that's a single click either in ASTA or P6. Both of them have it. Schedule comparison, that's what we call a digger report. ASTA doesn't have it, but P6 does have it. There are multiple softwares out there that you can extract all the changes that's been applied on one update from the previous, and the narrative report. The narrative report should have at a minimum the following paragraphs. First section is just key dates and the key performance indices, or the indices that we extracted. These are the updates: the data date, what's the overall duration percent, performance percent complete, what's the completion date, total flow, CPI, SPI, and so on and so forth. General summary, just summarizing what happened this month, how it happened, progress summary, summarizing the longest path and the near critical path is in a simple narrative form, so you'd be able to understand once you get back to these documents for any of the reasons we mentioned. Most importantly, add any changes based on the change management section that Dan mentioned. Any modifications, impacts should be added in here in details, specifically the impacts. So, like for example, I would say impact 1 and a title for it, and then I will include the story, like every month add up to it. This month, this and this and this happened to these activities. It was impacted for this reason, and until now, that's all what we know. And then the following month, add to it as the impact progresses. This is very important for documentation. By the time you complete the project, on the last update, you would have a list of all the impacts that affected the project and the story for each impact, what happened and how it happened and what did it affect. And the breakdown for these paragraphs should match exactly what's in the schedule. That's an extract from one of our schedules. As you can see here, like impacts 1 through 13. Each of these has activities in the schedule, and each of these has a paragraph in the narrative that describes in detail what happened. Same thing for the modification, list of modification with the type of modification, costs associated, and broken down in the same way with the same title and having the proper activities. This section is very important, the changes that you applied. So all the quality checks, all the revisions that you applied in a specific update should be captured in this paragraph. Have you added activities? What are these activities and why you added it? Have you deleted any activities? Have you changed original durations? These are very important. It is some work, but it's very important for capturing an actual status and in conflict resolution if needed. Any changes in sequence, any changes in constraints, and any cost changes if cost loaded. Last is the weather logs. As I mentioned, that's the actual weather per day, listed down monthly or periodically, the actual weather that happened. If you have anticipated or allowable number compared to, and come up with a variance to claim for it at the very end of the project. That just put a title page and an index and group it all up into one nice PDF that has the narrative report with all the exhibits of the layouts attached to it, and then the P6 or the asset file, and save it. Last, we just established a shared folder database for the federal side where we had all the projects dumped into a database sorted out by areas, where each area manager would have access to the projects within his area, and the regional manager would have access to the entire areas. And we have it on a shared drive, and this gets updated monthly. So within each month, all the project managers or the schedulers doing the updates put the update document that we just discussed into these folders, so everyone have access to this database in case anything happened. And resources and cost loaded, I wouldn't go through it. It's just read through it. It's self-explanatory, and this is the application of cost to resource loading if needed into a schedule.
When you're saving your monthly updates, you need to put them into a folder and then not touch them anymore. If you need to go back and look at the previous schedule update, you should make a copy of it. And that's so what you do have is you have the exact electronic file that was submitted to the government or to the owner in this case. And that way you have the contemporaneous documents. In fact, we do have to go to litigation that we can go back to and look at. Just having a PDF to look at,
Yep.
it makes it very difficult because you don't know all the relationships and the logic.
No,
et
the
cetera.
XR, you have to put the either Pastel 365 with the PDF file. Definitely.
All right, so I'm just gonna, 2 slides to bring it home for a landing. And first of all, thank you all very much for having us out here and taking time out of your projects to learn a little bit about this stuff or to get a refresher. We want to make you aware that, you know, as a part of the company that we're all a part of now under the Erascom umbrella, that, you know, Dowie is here with his schedule expertise, and Frank and I are here, you know, to help you guys support any claims for entitlement or whatever the nuanced contractual issues that you find yourself dealing with. We've spent a long time dealing exclusively with project issues, and so we're fairly uniquely suited to help people get through them. And so we just want to make you guys aware that we're here, and we're happy to get involved with your projects and help out however we can. Simple stuff here. As we've gone through, make sure that you're exercising the solid fundamentals and in how you're creating your schedules and how you're maintaining them. Status them with the impact activities and maintain good documentation. And you're gonna save yourselves a lot of heartache later on in the event that you do have to haggle over or dispute changes to the agreement. Oops. Know what goes into a TIA. The one area that we didn't get into today that we could spend some more time on either in the later session or tomorrow morning are some of the details of time impact analysis. Delay analysis is a topic that we could really spend a lot of time on. It's a little bit more complicated than you ordinarily will have project managers or project team members typically put together, but the concepts themselves are not all that difficult, so we can go through it conceptually so that you guys can kind of understand the basic approach to evaluating multiple delays, and then you guys will at least have that knowledge as as you're working through your project. So if there's any questions, we're happy to take questions. Otherwise, thank you very much.
Thanks.
So there's 2 times, right? If the contract requires it, or if the judge thinking of it.
I want to talk. Yeah. Thank you.